The gunshot shattered the frozen silence before Margaret even saw his face. She stood at the cabin door, carpetbag trembling in her grip, staring at the blood-streaked snow and the tall, dark figure reloading his rifle with hands steady as iron. The town council said she'd be safe here. They lied. Caleb Vance didn't even look up when he spoke. His voice low, cold, final. Get inside. Lock the door. Don't come out till I say. This is their story. 2 outcasts, 1 storm, and the choice that changed everything. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind screamed across the high plains like something wounded and dying, whipping curtains of snow into blinding white walls that swallowed the world whole. Red Hollow was already half buried, its crooked buildings hunched low against the fury of the worst winter storm the territory had seen in 10 years. Smoke struggled from chimneys, only to be torn away by gusts that rattled shutters and shook timbers until even the sturdiest structures groaned in protest. Inside the cramped meeting hall that doubled as the general store, the town council convened with the grim efficiency of men accustomed to hard decisions. 6 of them sat in a half circle around a pot-bellied stove that radiated more anxiety than heat. Mayor Tobias Grant, a weathered ox of a man with steel-gray whiskers and eyes like frozen river stones, cleared his throat. "We've got a problem," he announced, though everyone already knew. 2 problems, if we're being honest. Jeremiah Lott, the blacksmith, crossed his arms. His knuckles were permanently scarred from decades at the forge, and his patience had worn just as thin. "You mean Vance and the schoolteacher?" "I mean exactly that." Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Storm's not letting up. Doc says it'll be 3, maybe 4 more days before the pass clears. The ranger station up near Widow's Peak, it's the only structure for 20 miles that'll hold against this wind. We can't leave it empty, and we sure as hell can't afford to lose it." "So send Vance," said August Perry, the feed store owner, his voice tight with distrust. "He's the one who knows the high country, probably already got half his stolen goods cached up there anyway." "Watch your mouth, August." This from Samuel Briggs, the only man on the council who'd ever spoken a fair word about Caleb Vance. "You got proof of that? Or you just repeating saloon gossip?" Perry's jaw worked. "Everyone knows what he is." "Everyone thinks they know," Briggs corrected. "There's a difference." Grant raised a hand, cutting off the argument before it could spiral. "The point is, someone's got to man that station. Keep the stove going, keep the roof from caving in, and make sure no squatters or drifters hole up there and burn the place down. Vance knows the land. He's the logical choice." "And the schoolteacher?" Lott's question hung heavy in the air. Grant's expression darkened. Margaret Hales got nowhere else to go. Her boarding room at the Morrow House collapsed last night. Roof gave in under the snow load. She's been staying in the church basement, but Reverend Cole says the foundation's cracking. If we don't move her, she'll freeze or get buried. The ranger cabin's the only option. "You're sending a single woman to share a cabin with a man like Vance?" Perry's outrage was performative, but the concern beneath it wasn't entirely false. "I'm sending 2 adults to survive a storm," Grant snapped. "Vance won't touch her. He's got more honor than half the so-called gentlemen in this town. And Miss Hale's tougher than she looks. You all saw her handle the Pritchard boys when they tried to run her out of the schoolhouse." Briggs nodded slowly. "She didn't flinch." "No," Grant agreed. "She didn't." The decision was made, though not without grumbling. Within the hour, word spread through Red Hollow like a grass fire. By the time the sun bled weak and pale through the storm clouds, everyone knew the outlaw and the schoolteacher were being sent away together. Some whispered it was mercy. Others called it madness. A few quietly wondered if the council was hoping the problem would solve itself, one way or another. Margaret Hale stood in the church vestibule, her green wool coat buttoned to the throat, her dark hair pinned so tightly it made her scalp ache. She was 26 years old, educated in Boston, and entirely, devastatingly alone. Red Hollow had seemed like an opportunity when she'd answered the advertisement 6 months ago. School teacher needed, frontier town, room and board provided. What they hadn't mentioned was that the town didn't want a school teacher. They wanted someone to confirm their children weren't savages, to add a veneer of civilization they could point to when circuit judges or land speculators passed through. They didn't want her opinions on curriculum, her insistence that girls deserved the same education as boys, or her refusal to teach from a Bible primer alone. She'd made enemies, not violent ones, but the slow, cold kind. Women who stopped inviting her to quilting circles, men who forgot to tip their hats, children whose parents suddenly needed them home during school hours. The boarding house collapse had been an accident, but the lack of offers to take her in afterward, that was deliberate. Miss Hale. Mayor Grant's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, snow-crusted on his shoulders. You ready? She nodded, though her hands were shaking. Where exactly am I going? Widow's Peak Ranger Station, about 8 miles north. Caleb Vance will be there. Her stomach dropped. The outlaw? He's not an outlaw, Grant said, though his tone suggested even he wasn't entirely convinced. He's never been charged with anything, never been caught doing anything, but he keeps to himself, and folks talk. You'll be safe. I give you my word. Margaret wanted to ask what his word was worth, but she swallowed the question. How long? Until the storm breaks. 3, maybe 4 days. 4 days. Alone with a man the town feared. In a cabin miles from anywhere. She felt the weight of it settle over her like a shroud. And if I refuse? Grant's expression softened, but only slightly. Then you sleep in a collapsing church and hope the roof holds. Your choice, Miss Hale. It wasn't a choice. They both knew it. Caleb Vance was already at the stable when they arrived, saddling a broad-chested sorrel mare with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. He didn't look up when Margaret and the mayor entered, but she knew he'd heard them. Everything about him suggested coiled awareness, the way he stood, the deliberate economy of his movements, the stillness that wasn't relaxation, but readiness. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with shoulders that strained the seams of his oilskin duster. His hair was dark, almost black, and long enough to brush his collar. A week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and his eyes, when he finally did glance up, were the color of smoke over deep water. Unreadable. Guarded. Vance, Grant said. This is Margaret Hale. She'll be staying at the ranger station with you until the storm passes. Caleb's gaze flicked to Margaret, held for a fraction of a second, then returned to the saddle straps. That's so. It wasn't a question. You got a problem with that? Grant's tone sharpened. Didn't say I did. Caleb pulled a strap tight, testing the tension. Just clarifying the arrangement. Margaret found her voice. I can take care of myself, Mr. Vance. I won't be a burden. Now he did look at her, really look, in a way that made her feel simultaneously seen and assessed. Didn't figure you would be, ma'am, but the cabin's small and the storm's mean. We'll manage. There was no warmth in his voice, but no hostility either. Just flat, pragmatic acceptance. It should have reassured her. Instead, it made her feel like a problem being solved, a logistics challenge rather than a person. Grant handed Caleb a burlap sack. Supplies. Enough for a week if you're careful. Coffee, salt pork, cornmeal, beans. There's a root cellar at the station with canned goods, and the well's covered, so you'll have water. Caleb took the sack, slinging it over the mare's back. Appreciated. And Vance? Grant's voice dropped. You keep her safe. Anything happens to Miss Hale, and you'll answer for it. Clear? Caleb's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Clear. The ride north was brutal. Margaret sat behind Caleb on the mare, her arms wrapped around her carpet bag because touching him felt impossible, even for balance. The wind cut through her coat like knives, and the snow was so thick she could barely see the horse's ears in front of her. Caleb navigated by instinct and memory, his body a solid wall against the storm's fury. He didn't speak. Not once. Not to warn her of rough ground, not to ask if she was cold, not to offer reassurance. He simply rode, guiding the mare with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, his focus absolute. Margaret's teeth chattered so hard she thought they'd crack. Her fingers went numb inside her gloves, and her face felt like ice stretched over bone. She wanted to ask how much farther, but pride kept her silent. If he could endure this without complaint, so could she. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes, the cabin emerged from the white void like a ghost taking shape. It was small, maybe 20 feet to a side, built from rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from the center, and a narrow porch sagged slightly under the weight of snow. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and in that moment it looked like salvation. Caleb dismounted smoothly, then turned to help Margaret down. She hesitated, then accepted his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, and warm despite the cold. He steadied her when her legs buckled. She'd been on the horse so long her muscles had locked, then released her immediately. "Inside, Joe," he said. "I'll see to the horse." Margaret stumbled toward the cabin, her boots crunching through knee-deep drifts. The door was unlocked. Out here, there was no point in locks. And she shoved it open, stepping into a darkness that smelled of old smoke, pine resin, and mouse droppings. She stood there shivering, listening to the storm howl outside and the silence press in around her, and felt the full weight of her isolation settle over her like a stone. Caleb worked quickly, unsaddling the mare and leading her to the lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north side. The structure was barely weathertight, but it cut the wind, and there was hay stacked in the corner, dry, thank God. He rubbed the horse down with a frayed blanket, checked her hooves, and filled a bucket with water from the covered well. Only then did he allow himself to think about the woman inside. Margaret Hale, the schoolteacher. He'd seen her around town, hard not to, given how small Red Hollow was, but they'd never spoken. She was the kind of woman who drew attention without trying. Straight-backed, sharp-eyed, with a way of moving that suggested she knew exactly who she was and refused to apologize for it. The town didn't like that. Caleb understood why. He didn't like it either, but for different reasons. People who were certain of themselves were dangerous. They didn't bend. They broke, or they made others break. And out here, in a place where survival depended on flexibility and compromise, that kind of rigidity could get you killed. Still, Grant had sworn she could handle herself. Caleb hoped that was true, because the next few days were going to test them both. He finished with the mare, grabbed the supply sack, and headed for the cabin. Inside, Margaret had managed to light a candle stub she'd found on the mantel. The weak flame revealed a space even smaller than she'd imagined. A single room with a stone hearth, a rough plank table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a narrow cot shoved against the far wall. A shelf held a few tin plates, a battered coffee pot, and a jar of nails. That was it. No second cot, no partition, no privacy. Her chest tightened. The door opened and Caleb entered, bringing a gust of wind and snow with him. He kicked the door shut, dropped the supply sack on the table, and immediately began building a fire. He moved with the same silent efficiency he'd shown all day, layering kindling and logs with the precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times in 1,000 places just like this. Within minutes, flames crackled to life, and warmth began to seep into the frozen air. Margaret cleared her throat. "Thank you." Caleb glanced at her, then back at the fire. "For what?" "For this. Getting us here. The fire." He shrugged. "It's what needed doing." She waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he shrugged out of his duster, hung it on a peg by the door, and began unpacking the supplies with methodical care. Coffee. Salt pork. Cornmeal. Beans. He set each item on the shelf, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. Margaret watched him, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the rumors. They said he was a thief, a drifter, a killer. They said he'd ridden with outlaw gangs in Kansas, that he'd shot men in cold blood, that he disappeared for weeks at a time and came back with blood on his boots and gold in his pockets. But the man in front of her didn't look like a killer. He looked tired, worn down, like someone who'd spent too long carrying something heavy and had forgotten how to put it down. "Mr. Vance," she began. "Caleb." His voice was flat. No need for formality. "Caleb, then." She hesitated. "About the sleeping arrangements." "You take the cot," he said, cutting her off. "I'll sleep by the fire. It's warmer there anyway." Relief and guilt warred in her chest. That doesn't seem fair. Fair's got nothing to do with it. He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something other than blankness in his eyes, something that might have been weariness or resignation, or both. "You're here because the town had nowhere else to put you. I'm here because they don't trust me in Red Hollow when they can't see me. We're both exiles, Miss Hale. Might as well be comfortable." The word hit her like a slap. Exiles. It was true, and hearing it said aloud made it real in a way she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. "Margaret," she said quietly, "if we're dispensing with formality." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Margaret." They stood there for a moment, two strangers in a too small room, bound together by a storm and a town that wanted them gone. Then Caleb turned back to the supplies, and the moment passed. Night fell fast and hard, the storm intensifying until the wind sounded less like wind and more like a living thing trying to claw its way inside. Margaret sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee so bitter it made her throat burn. Caleb sat across from her, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that gleamed in the firelight. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. But the silence wasn't entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people learning the shape of each other's presence, the boundaries of shared space. Margaret found herself watching the way Caleb's hands moved. Steady, precise, never wasted motion. There was something almost meditative about it. "What are you making?" she asked finally. He didn't look up. "Nothing, just keeping my hands busy." "Do you always do that?" "When I can't sleep." "And you can't sleep often?" Now he did look up, his gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Often enough." She wanted to ask why, but the look on his face told her she wouldn't get an answer. So instead she said, "I can't sleep either, usually." "Why?" The question surprised her. It was the first personal thing he'd asked. "Too much thinking, I suppose. Too many things I can't fix." "Like what?" "Like everything." She gave a bitter laugh. "The town, the school. The fact that I came out here thinking I could make a difference, and instead I've just made enemies." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "People don't like being told they're wrong, especially when they know you're right." Margaret blinked. "You think I'm right?" "I think you're trying. That's more than most people do." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd received in months, and it struck her harder than she expected. She looked down at her coffee, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb went back to whittling, and the silence returned. But this time it felt different, warmer, less like isolation and more like understanding. But the first night passed without incident, though neither of them slept much. Margaret lay on the cot, wrapped in her coat and a thin blanket, listening to the storm and the sound of Caleb breathing by the fire. He didn't snore, didn't toss or turn. He just lay there, still as death, and she wondered if he was asleep or just pretending. Morning came gray and bitter. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had worsened. Snow piled against the cabin walls in drifts so high they blocked the lower half of the window. Caleb rose before dawn, fed the fire, and made coffee in silence. Margaret woke to the smell of it and sat up, her body aching from the cot's unforgiving planks. "Morning," Caleb said without looking at her. "Morning." Her voice was hoarse. He handed her a cup, and she took it gratefully, savoring the warmth against her palms. They drank in silence, standing near the fire, and for a moment it almost felt normal, domestic, like they'd done this 100 times before. Then Caleb set his cup down and said, "I need to check the stable, make sure the mare's all right." "I'll come with you." He frowned. "No need, it's brutal out there." "I know, but I can't just sit here." She met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I won't be dead weight, Caleb. If we're stuck here together, I pull my share." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or surprise. He nodded slowly. "All right, but stay close. This wind'll knock you flat if you're not careful." They bundled up and stepped outside into a world of white chaos. The wind hit like a fist, stealing Margaret's breath and sending her staggering. Caleb caught her elbow, steadying her, and together they fought their way to the lean-to. The mare was fine, cold, but fine. Caleb fed her, checked her over, and replaced her water. Margaret helped where she could, holding buckets and scooping hay, and by the time they made it back inside, they were both half frozen and gasping. But as they stripped off their coats and huddled by the fire, something had changed. They'd worked together, relied on each other, and survived. It was small, but it mattered. The second day bled into the third. Time lost meaning in the cabin's dim interior, marked only by the rhythm of feeding the fire, rationing food, and waiting for the storm to break. Margaret and Caleb fell into an unspoken routine. She cooked simple, rough meals of cornmeal mush and salt pork, while he maintained the cabin, checking for leaks, reinforcing the door, and keeping the firewood stocked. They talked more, not about anything deep, just small things. Margaret told him about Boston, about her father who'd been a professor, and her mother who'd died when she was 12. Caleb told her about growing up in Missouri, about working cattle drives and learning to track game from an old Osage hunter named Two Wolves. He didn't talk about the rumors. She didn't ask. But she began to see him more clearly. The way he moved, always aware, always ready, spoke of a hard life lived on the edge. The scars on his hands, the old bullet wound high on his shoulder that she glimpsed when he reached for something on the top shelf. The haunted look that sometimes flickered across his face when he thought she wasn't watching. All of it painted a picture of a man who'd survived things that should have killed him. And yet, he was gentle with the horse, patient when teaching her how to bank the fire properly, quiet but not cold, guarded but not cruel. She realized with a start that she trusted him, not because the town said she should, but because she'd seen who he was when no one was watching. On the afternoon of the third day the wolves came. Margaret was standing by the window, peering out at the endless white, when she saw them, 4 lean shapes moving through the snow like gray ghosts. Their eyes gleamed yellow in the fading light, and their movements were coordinated, purposeful. Caleb, her voice was tight. He was at her side in an instant, following her gaze. His jaw tightened. Damn. What do they want? The horse. They can smell her. He moved to the door, checking the bar. They won't come inside, but they'll circle. Wait for us to make a mistake. Margaret's heart hammered. What do we do? We don't make a mistake. He crossed to his saddlebag, pulled out a revolver and a rifle. You know how to shoot? She hesitated, then nodded. My father taught me. I'm not an expert, but I can hit a target. Good enough. He handed her the revolver. Don't fire unless they breach the door or the stable. We can't afford to waste ammunition. They stood watch as the light died, taking turns at the window while the wolves prowled. The mare whinnied in fear, and the sound clawed at Margaret's nerves. She wanted to do something, anything, but Caleb's calm kept her grounded. They'll leave, he said quietly, once they realize we're not easy prey. You sound certain. I've dealt with wolves before, and you're still here. He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw the ghost of a smile. So far. Hours passed. The wolves didn't leave. If anything, they grew bolder, creeping closer, testing the boundaries. One of them, a massive male with a torn ear, approached the stable door sniffing, and Caleb raised the rifle. Steady, he murmured, more to himself than to her. The wolf pawed at the door. The mare screamed. Caleb fired. The shot cracked like thunder, and the wolf yelped, leaping back. Blood stained the snow where it had stood. The pack scattered, melting into the darkness, and for a long moment there was only the wind and the pounding of Margaret's heart. Caleb lowered the rifle, his expression grim. That'll buy us time, but they'll be back. Margaret's hands shook as she set the revolver down. How long? Depends how hungry they are. The wolves returned just before dawn. This time they didn't circle. They attacked. Margaret woke to the sound of splintering wood and the mare's terrified screams. Caleb was already up, rifle in hand, and he threw the door open without hesitation. Stay inside, Dre, he shouted, but Margaret grabbed the revolver and followed. The scene was chaos. The lead wolf had broken through the stable door, and the others were pouring in after it. The mare reared, hooves flashing, and Caleb fired twice, dropping one wolf and wounding another. But there were too many, and they were too fast. Margaret didn't think. She aimed at the nearest wolf and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her off her feet, but the shot struck true. The wolf collapsed, and the others hesitated, confused by the second threat. Good shot! Caleb didn't take his eyes off the pack. Again! She fired. And again. And again. Each shot was a roar that drowned out her fear. And when the revolver clicked empty, she grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it like a club. The wolves broke. One moment they were a snarling mass of teeth and fury, and the next they were gone, vanishing into the storm like smoke. Caleb and Margaret stood in the wreckage of the stable, gasping, covered in blood and snow. The mare was alive, bleeding from a gash on her flank, but alive. They worked together to clean and bind the wound, neither speaking, their hands moving in sync. When it was done, they returned to the cabin and collapsed by the fire. "You didn't stay inside," Caleb said finally. "No. Could have gotten yourself killed. So could you." He looked at her, and she looked back, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, the kind of bond forged only in shared danger. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not running." Margaret managed a tired smile. "Where would I go?" He almost laughed. Almost. But the sound died in his throat, and he turned back to the fire, his expression unreadable. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, in the small, battered cabin, two exiles sat side by side, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt quite so alone. Well, the fourth day dawned with a strange, unsettling quiet. The wind had finally eased, and pale sunlight struggled through the thinning clouds. Margaret woke to the sound of Caleb moving around the cabin, checking supplies, and for a moment she allowed herself to hope. "Storm's breaking," he said when he saw her stirring. "We'll be able to head back tomorrow, maybe the day after." She nodded, though the thought filled her with an unexpected pang. Going back meant returning to a town that didn't want her, to a life of cold shoulders and closed doors. Out here, at least, she'd felt useful. Needed. "Are you glad?" she asked. Caleb paused, considering. "I'm glad you'll be safe." "And you?" "I'll manage. Always do." It wasn't an answer, but she didn't press. Instead, she rose, washed her face in the icy water from the bucket, and set about making breakfast. They ate in companionable silence, and for a little while, it was easy to pretend the world beyond the cabin didn't exist. But it did, and it was coming for them. The riders appeared just after noon. Margaret saw them first, dark shapes moving against the white landscape coming from the south. 5 of them, riding hard despite the snow. Her stomach twisted. "Caleb!" He was at the window in an instant, his expression going cold and hard. "Damn!" "Who are they?" "Trouble." He grabbed the rifle, checked the load. "Get your things, now." "What? Why?" "Because those aren't townspeople, Margaret, and they're not here by accident." Fear clawed at her throat. "Who are they?" Caleb's jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something raw and dangerous flicker in his eyes. "Ghosts. From a life I thought I'd left behind." The riders were close enough now that she could make out details. Hard faces, heavy coats, rifles slung across their backs. They moved with the predatory confidence of men who knew they had the advantage. And leading them, on a scarred roan gelding, was a man with a face like carved granite and eyes that burned with focused hatred. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. Rhett Calder. Margaret's blood ran cold. She didn't know the name, but she knew death when she saw it. "What does he want?" Caleb didn't answer. He just cocked the rifle, his hand steady despite the storm brewing in his eyes, and said, "Whatever happens next, stay behind me. Understand?" She nodded, though her voice had fled. The riders stopped 50 yards from the cabin. Rhett Calder dismounted slowly, deliberately, and walked forward until he was close enough to be heard. "Caleb Vance!" His voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "Been a long time." Caleb stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely but ready. "Not long enough, Rhett." Calder grinned. A cold, mirthless thing. "You remember me. Good. Means you remember my brother, too." "I remember." "Then you know why I'm here." Margaret's mind raced. Brother. Remember. Something terrible had happened between these men, something that had festered and turned poisonous with time. Caleb's voice was steady. "Your brother made his choice, Rhett. Same as you're making yours now." "My brother's in prison because of you," Calder's shout echoed across the snow. "You turned him in, sold him out to save your own skin." "I didn't sell anyone out." "He got caught because he was reckless and stupid. That's on him." "Liar!" Calder's hand dropped to his gun. "You're going to pay for what you did, Vance. You and anyone fool enough to stand with you." Margaret's heart stopped. Anyone fool enough to stand with you? He meant her. Caleb's voice dropped, cold and final. "The woman's got nothing to do with this. Let her go." "No." Calder's grin widened. "She stays. Makes it more interesting." And in that moment, Margaret understood. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about power, about making Caleb suffer in every possible way. She stepped forward, ignoring Caleb's hissed warning, and shouted, "I'm not a pawn in your grudge." Calder's gaze swung to her, appraising, and she saw the cruelty in his eyes. "Then you're a fool." "Maybe." Her voice shook, but she held her ground. "But I won't let you use me to hurt him." For a long, frozen moment, no one moved. Then Calder laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and drew his gun. "Your choice," he said, and the world exploded into violence. Caleb moved first, firing before Calder's gun had fully cleared leather. The shot took Calder in the shoulder, spinning him, and the other riders scattered, diving for cover and returning fire. Bullets tore through the cabin walls, shattering the window, and Margaret hit the floor as splinters rained down. "Get to the back!" Caleb roared, levering another round into the rifle. "Now!" She scrambled toward the rear of the cabin, her mind blank with terror, but something stopped her. He can't hold them alone. She grabbed the revolver, still unloaded from the wolf attack, and fumbled for ammunition. Her hand shook so badly she dropped half the bullets, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus, and loaded 6 rounds with agonizing slowness. Outside, the gunfire was relentless. Caleb crouched by the doorway, firing in controlled bursts. But he was outnumbered and outgunned. 1 man against 5. The math was brutal. Margaret took up position by the shattered window, aimed at a figure darting between snowdrifts, and fired. The recoil jolted her arms, and the shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the man dive for cover. Caleb glanced back, his eyes wide with fury and fear. "What the hell are you doing?" "Helping! You're going to get killed! So are you!" There was no time to argue. Another volley of shots peppered the cabin, and Caleb returned fire, his jaw set. Margaret reloaded with shaking hands, aimed again, and this time her shot found flesh. A man yelped and went down, clutching his leg. "Good shot," Caleb muttered, and the edge of his mouth quirked, almost a smile. They worked in grim synchrony after that, Caleb holding the front, Margaret covering the window, both of them burning through ammunition far too fast. The attackers pressed closer, emboldened, and Margaret knew with cold certainty that they couldn't hold. Not alone. Then, impossibly, she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats and shouting voices from the south. Caleb heard it too. He risked a glance over his shoulder, and his expression shifted, disbelief warring with hope. "The town," he breathed. The riders came like an avalanche, a dozen men from Red Hollow, led by Mayor Grant and Samuel Briggs, their rifles raised and their faces set with fury. They must have seen the smoke from the gunfire, must have realized what was happening, and ridden out despite the storm. Calder's men broke immediately, scattering into the snow, but Calder himself stood his ground, his gun aimed at Caleb with shaking, bloody hands. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "It is." Grant and the others closed in, and Calder finally lowered his gun, his face twisted with rage and defeat. The other attackers were rounded up, some wounded, some fleeing into the wilderness where the cold would finish what the townspeople started. It was over. Margaret stood in the wreckage of the cabin, her ears ringing, her hand still clutching the revolver. Caleb was beside her, bleeding from a graze along his ribs, but alive. They were both alive. Grant dismounted, his face grim. "You two all right?" Caleb nodded. "We'll live." "Good." Grant looked at Calder, now being bound by 2 of the townsmen, then back at Caleb. "You saved her, held them off until we got here. That takes guts." "She saved herself," Caleb corrected, glancing at Margaret. "And me." Grant's gaze shifted to Margaret, and she saw something new in his eyes. Respect. "Miss Hale, I owe you an apology, we all do." Margaret's voice was hoarse. "For what?" "For not seeing what you were made of." He tipped his hat. "Red Hollow could use more people like you." She didn't know what to say, So she just nodded, and Grant turned away, barking orders to his men. As the townspeople secured the prisoners and prepared for the ride back, Margaret and Caleb stood together on the porch, watching the sun break through the clouds for the first time in days. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know, but I'm not running anymore." She looked at him, saw the resolve in his eyes, and felt something settle in her chest, something warm and steady and utterly unexpected. "Neither am I," she said. And as the storm finally broke and the world emerged white and clean and new, two exiles stood side by side, no longer alone, no longer afraid. The town had cast them out. The storm had bound them together. And what came next, whatever came next, they would face it not as outcasts, but as equals. Not just surviving, but living. The ride back to Red Hollow should have felt like a victory procession, but it didn't. The wounded were tied across their saddles, Rhett Calder among them, his shoulder wrapped in blood-stained cloth and his eyes burning with a hatred that hadn't dimmed despite his defeat. The townsmen rode in tight formation, rifles ready, their faces grim with the knowledge of how close things had come to disaster. Margaret sat behind Caleb on the sorrel mare once more, but this time her arms were wrapped around his waist without hesitation. She could feel the tension in his body, the way his muscles stayed coiled even though the immediate danger had passed. He'd been shot at, bled, fought for his life and hers, and now he was riding back into a town that had never trusted him to begin with. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort or gratitude or some acknowledgement of what they'd survived together, but the words wouldn't come. So she simply held on and felt him breathe, and tried to reconcile the man she'd spent 4 days with in that cabin with the dangerous outlaw the town believed him to be. Mayor Grant rode up alongside them, his expression unreadable beneath the frost coating his beard. "We'll get you both to Doc Morrison soon as we're back. Get those wounds looked at proper." Caleb nodded but said nothing. Grant hesitated, then added, "What you did back there, holding off Calder and his crew, that took sand. More than most men have." "I didn't have a choice," Caleb replied flatly. "We always have choices, Vance. You could have run, left Miss Hale and saved your own skin. You didn't." Grant's gaze shifted to Margaret. "Neither of you did." Margaret felt the weight of his words, the shift they represented. This wasn't just acknowledgement. It was the beginning of something else. Respect, maybe. Or at least the possibility of it. "Thank you for coming when you did," she said quietly. "If you'd been even a few minutes later—" "Don't think about that," Grant interrupted. "You're both alive. That's what matters." He spurred his horse forward, leaving them in the wake of his unspoken question. What came next? The question hung in the cold air between them, unanswered and immense. Red Hollow emerged from the white landscape like a cluster of dark stones half buried in snow. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the streets, what could be seen of them beneath the drifts, were empty save for a few hardy souls clearing paths with shovels. As the riders entered town, doors began to open and faces appeared in windows, eyes wide with curiosity and concern. Word had already spread somehow. It always did in small towns. The schoolteacher and the outlaw attacked at the ranger station. A gunfight. Blood in the snow. The details would be garbled and exaggerated, but the core truth remained: something had changed. They stopped in front of Doc Morrison's office, a narrow clapboard building that smelled of carbolic acid and old leather. Grant dismounted and helped Margaret down while Caleb slid off the mare with a wince that he tried to hide. His hand went to his ribs, and Margaret saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "You're still bleeding," she said sharply. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. You've been shot." "Grazed," he corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. Doc Morrison appeared in the doorway, a wiry man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that never stopped moving. "Inside, both of you. Now. Grant, get those prisoners to the jailhouse and send someone for the marshal. This is beyond town law now." Grant nodded and began barking orders. Caleb and Margaret followed the doctor into his cramped office, where shelves lined with bottles and medical texts competed for space with an examination table covered in cracked leather. "Sit," Morrison ordered, pointing at the table. Caleb obeyed with obvious reluctance, and the doctor began cutting away his shirt with practiced efficiency. Margaret stood nearby, trying not to stare at the expanse of scarred skin that emerged. Old wounds layered over older ones, a map of violence written in flesh. Morrison hissed through his teeth. "This is more than a graze, son. Bullet tore through the muscle clean. You're lucky it didn't nick a rib." "Feels lucky," Caleb muttered. The doctor cleaned the wound with alcohol, and Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't make a sound. Margaret watched, fascinated and horrified in equal measure, as Morrison stitched the torn flesh with quick, neat movements. "You've done this before," Margaret observed. Morrison glanced at her. Army surgeon, back during the war, saw enough bullet wounds to last 3 lifetimes. He tied off the final stitch and reached for a roll of bandages. "This'll hurt like hell for a week, and you'll need to keep it clean. No heavy lifting, no fighting, no stupidity." "Clear?" "Clear," Caleb said, though his tone suggested he had no intention of following those instructions. Morrison turned to Margaret. "Your turn, Miss Hale. Any injuries I should know about?" She shook her head. "Just bruises and exhaustion." "Let me be the judge of that." He examined her hands, scraped and raw from handling the revolver, and checked her for signs of shock or hypothermia. Finding nothing serious, he wrapped her hands in clean cloth and gave her a stern look. "You need rest. Real rest. Not the kind you get in a cabin under siege. Mrs. Garrett runs the boarding house on Elm Street. She's got a room, and she owes me a favor. I'll send word." "I can pay," Margaret began, but Morrison waved her off. "You held off armed men with a handgun you barely knew how to use. Consider the room payment for services rendered to this ungrateful town." He handed her a small bottle. "Laudanum. A few drops in water before bed if you can't sleep. Don't overdo it." Margaret accepted the bottle with numb fingers, still processing the idea that she had a place to stay. A room. Not a collapsing church basement or a borrowed cot, but an actual room. "Thank you," she whispered. Morrison's expression softened. "You did good out there, Miss Hale. Don't let anyone tell you different." Gosh. By the time they emerged from the doctor's office, the sun had dipped below the western peaks, and the temperature was plummeting. Grant was waiting outside with Samuel Briggs and 2 other councilmen, Jeremiah Lott and a lean cattleman named Owen Hendricks. "Prisoners are secured," Grant reported. "Marshal's been sent for. He'll be here in 2, maybe 3 days, depending on the roads." Caleb nodded, his face pale but composed. "What about Calder?" "He'll hang," Briggs said bluntly. "Attempted murder, assault with intent, attacking a lawman's station. There's no walking away from this." "And the others?" "Depends what they confess to. But they're looking at hard time, minimum." Grant's gaze settled on Caleb with an intensity that made Margaret's stomach tighten. "We need to talk. All of us. About what happens next." Caleb's expression went carefully blank. "I figured." "Not here," Grant said. "The council hall. 1 hour. Miss Hale, you should be there too." Margaret blinked. "Me? Why?" "Because you were there. You're part of this now, whether you want to be or not." It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Dant. The council hall was warmer than Margaret remembered, the stove stoked high and lamps burning against the encroaching darkness. The 6 councilmen sat in their usual semicircle, but this time Caleb and Margaret were invited to sit as well, not as supplicants, but as something closer to equals. Grant opened the proceedings without preamble. "Let's speak plainly. 4 days ago, we sent you 2 to the ranger station because we had nowhere else to put you. We didn't expect you to become heroes." "We're not heroes," Caleb said quietly. "You held off 5 armed men until help arrived," Lott countered. "That's the definition of heroism where I come from." "We survived," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." "Maybe." Grant leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "But the fact remains. This town owes you, both of you. And we need to figure out what that means." August Perry, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Mayor, we don't owe Vance anything. He was defending himself. That's not the same as defending the town." "He was defending Miss Hale," Briggs shot back. "A member of this community. That makes it the town's business." "Calder came for me," Caleb interjected, his voice hard. "Not for Red Hollow. If I'd left, none of this would have happened. And if you'd left, Miss Hale would be dead, Grant said bluntly. Or worse, you stayed. You fought. That counts. The room fell silent. Margaret felt the weight of their stares, the calculations happening behind every set of eyes. This wasn't just about gratitude. It was about power, perception, and the delicate social fabric of a frontier town where reputation meant everything. "What do you want from us?" she asked finally. Grant exchanged glances with the other councilmen. "Honesty, for starters." "Vance, where'd you really come from? What's your history with Rhett Calder?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but after a moment he spoke. "I rode with his brother, Eli, 5 years back. We were working cattle in Kansas, legitimate work, but Eli had other ideas. Started rustling on the side, selling stolen stock across the border. I didn't know until a deputy showed up asking questions. When I realized what Eli was doing, I told him to stop or I'd walk. He didn't stop. So I walked." "And turned him in?" Perry's voice was sharp with accusation. "No." Caleb's eyes were cold. "But I didn't lie for him either. When the law came asking where Eli was, I told them the truth. He was caught 2 days later with 30 head of stolen cattle. That's on him, not me." "Rhett didn't see it that way," Briggs observed. "Rhett sees what he wants to see, always has." Caleb's expression was bleak. "I knew he'd come for me eventually, just didn't expect it to take this long." "Oh," Grant nodded slowly. "And you, Miss Hale, why'd you really come to Red Hollow?" The question caught her off guard. "I answered an advertisement for a school teacher." "That's what you did. I asked why." Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty was the only currency worth spending. "Because I had nowhere else to go. My father died 6 months before I came here. He left debts I couldn't pay and a reputation I couldn't escape. Boston society decided I was unmarriageable and unemployable in equal measure. The frontier seemed like the only place where none of that would matter." "And did it?" Lot's question was gentler than she expected. "No," she admitted. "I brought my pride with me, and this town decided that was just as bad as my past." The silence that followed was thick with understanding. They were all exiles in their own way, people who'd come west to escape something only to find that distance didn't erase judgment. Finally, Grant spoke. "Here's what I propose. Vance, you've proven you can be trusted. The town needs a proper lawman, someone who knows the land and can handle trouble when it comes. I'm offering you the deputy position, pays $30 a month plus room and board." Caleb stared at him. "You want me to be a lawman? I want you to do what you did at that cabin. Stand your ground and protect people. We've been without a deputy since Tom Foster took a bullet last spring. You'd be filling a need. And if I say no," Grant's expression hardened, "then you're free to leave. But understand this, Rhett Calder's got friends, kin. They'll come looking for you eventually, and when they do, it'd be better if you had the law on your side instead of against you." It was a threat wrapped in an offer, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was also an opportunity, a chance for Caleb to step out of the shadows and claim a place in the light. Caleb looked at Margaret, and she saw the question in his eyes. She gave the smallest nod, and something in his expression eased. "I'll do it," he said, "on one condition." "Name it." "Miss Hale keeps her teaching position. No more whispers, no more parents pulling their kids out of school. She gets the respect she's earned." Grant's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "Done. Any objections?" Harry opened his mouth, caught Briggs's warning glare, and closed it again. "Then it's settled." Grant stood and extended his hand to Caleb. "Welcome to Red Hollow, Deputy Vance." Caleb shook it, his grip firm, and Margaret felt something shift in the room, a recalibration of power and possibility. She was next. Grant turned to her, his expression solemn. "Miss Hale, you've got more spine than half the men in this town. We'd be honored if you'd stay on as school teacher. And if there's anything you need for the school, books, supplies, repairs, you bring it to the council. We'll make it happen." Margaret's throat tightened. "Thank you." "Don't thank us yet," Lot said with a wry smile. "The Pritchard boys are still terrors. You'll earn every penny." She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound broke the tension like a stone through ice. The meeting adjourned, and Margaret and Caleb stepped out into the frozen night. The stars were brutal in their clarity, and the air was so cold it burned to breathe. They stood on the steps of the council hall, two people on the threshold of something new and uncertain. "You didn't have to do that," Margaret said quietly. "Making my job part of your condition." "Yes, I did." Caleb's voice was rough. "You saved my life back there. More than once. I'm not letting this town grind you down after that." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight spilling from the hall's windows, she could see the exhaustion etched into his features. "Why do you care?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because for 4 days, you didn't look at me like I was a criminal or a threat. You looked at me like I was just a man. No one's done that in a long time." The honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. She reached out without thinking and touched his arm, feeling the warmth of him through the rough fabric of his coat. "You are just a man," she said softly. "A good one." He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and something passed between them, fragile and fierce and far too dangerous to name. "We should get you to the boarding house," he said, his voice strained. "You need rest." "So do you. I'll manage." She wanted to argue, to insist that he stop carrying everything alone, but the set of his jaw told her it would be pointless. So she simply nodded, and they began walking through the snow-packed streets toward Mrs. Garrett's boarding house. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a sagging porch and cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. Mrs. Garrett herself answered the door, a round woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "You must be Miss Hale," she said, looking Margaret up and down. "Doc Morrison sent word. Come in, come in. You look half frozen." Margaret stepped inside gratefully, the warmth of the house enveloping her like a blanket. Caleb lingered on the threshold, and Mrs. Garrett fixed him with a stern look. "Deputy Vance, isn't it? Heard the council made it official." "Yes, ma'am." "Well, don't just stand there letting the cold in. Come have some coffee before you head out." Caleb hesitated, then stepped inside and closed the door. The boarding house's interior was cozy in a cluttered sort of way, overstuffed furniture, rag rugs, and the smell of stew and fresh bread lingering in the air. Mrs. Garrett bustled off to the kitchen, leaving them alone in the parlor. "You don't have to stay," Margaret said. "I know," but he didn't move. They stood there, awkward and uncertain, until Mrs. Garrett returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a plate of cornbread. "Eat," she ordered. "Both of you. You look like scarecrows." They ate because it was easier than arguing, and the food was good, simple and hearty, and exactly what they needed. Mrs. Garrett watched them with the keen attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people. "You two have been through hell," she said finally. "I can see it in your eyes, but you came out the other side, and that's what matters." "Thank you for the room," Margaret said. "I'll pay you as soon as—" "Already taken care of," Mrs. Garrett interrupted. "Doc Morrison settled your account for the first month. After that, we'll work something out." Margaret's eyes stung. Kindness, after so long without it, felt almost unbearable. Caleb set down his mug and stood. "I should go. Early start tomorrow." Margaret rose as well. "Thank you for everything." He nodded, his expression carefully neutral, and headed for the door, but he paused with his hand on the knob and looked back. "If you need anything," he said quietly, "you know where to find me." "The jailhouse?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The jailhouse." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt far too final. Mrs. Garrett watched Margaret's face and said nothing, but her knowing smile spoke volumes. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment and exhaustion. Margaret threw herself into preparing for the school's reopening, scrubbing desks, organizing books, and drafting lesson plans that would challenge her students without overwhelming them. The children returned slowly at first, brought by parents who'd heard about the gunfight and wanted to see the woman who'd faced down outlaws with a revolver. To her surprise, the Pritchard boys were among the first to return. Jake, the eldest at 13, slouched into the schoolroom with his younger brother Danny in tow and dropped into a seat with exaggerated reluctance. "Ma says we gotta come back," Jake announced. "Says you earned it or something." Margaret hid her smile. Your mother is a wise woman. She says you shot a man. I defended myself in Deputy Vance. There's a difference. Danny, who was 10 and far more earnest than his brother, leaned forward. Is it true the deputy used to be an outlaw? No, Margaret said firmly. It's true that people believed he was an outlaw. But believing something doesn't make it real. Deputy Vance is a good man who was judged unfairly. I hope you'll remember that the next time you're tempted to believe gossip. The boys exchanged glances, and something shifted in their expressions. Respect, maybe, or at least the beginning of understanding. By the end of the week, Margaret had 15 students. It was fewer than before, but it was a start. Caleb, meanwhile, was discovering that being a deputy involved far more tedium than heroism. His days consisted of patrolling the streets, checking locks on the general store, breaking up arguments at the saloon, and filling out paperwork for the marshal's office. The badge felt heavy on his chest, a constant reminder that he was being watched, judged, tested. The townspeople were wary, but not hostile. They nodded when he passed, answered his questions with cautious respect, and slowly, very slowly, began to treat him like part of the community rather than a threat to it. But the nights were harder. Alone in the small room behind the jailhouse, Caleb lay awake and replayed the gunfight in his mind. The sound of bullets tearing through wood, Margaret's fierce determination as she fired at Calder's men, the moment he thought he was going to die, and his only regret was that he wouldn't be able to protect her. He'd spent 5 years running from his past, and in 4 days, one stubborn schoolteacher had made him want to stop. It terrified him. They saw each other in passing, brief exchanges on the street, nods across the room at town gatherings, but they didn't seek each other out. It was as if both of them knew that whatever had started in that cabin was too raw, too intense to examine in the harsh light of ordinary life. But Red Hollow was a small town, and eventually their paths crossed properly. It happened at the general store. Margaret was purchasing supplies for the school, chalk, slates, a new globe to replace the one that had been damaged, when Caleb entered to pick up ammunition. They nearly collided at the counter, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Miss Hale, Caleb said, his voice carefully formal. Deputy Vance. She matched his tone, though her heart was hammering. The store owner, a gossipy woman named Edna Frost, watched them with barely concealed interest. How's the school? Caleb asked, filling the awkward silence. Growing, slowly. That's good. And your work? Quiet. Mostly. The conversation was stilted, ridiculous. Nothing like the raw honesty they'd shared in the cabin. Margaret hated it. She gathered her purchases and turned to leave, but Caleb's voice stopped her. Margaret. She froze. He'd used her first name, and the intimacy of it in public made Mrs. Frost's eyebrows shoot up. I'm glad you're settling in, he said quietly. She looked back at him and saw the truth beneath the formal words. I miss you. I don't know how to do this. I'm trying. Thank you, Caleb. She let his name linger, saw his eyes darken in response. I'm glad you are too. And then she left, her purchases clutched to her chest, her mind spinning. Cheat. The second week brought a new complication. Visitors. A delegation from the territorial government arrived to investigate the attack on the ranger station. 2 men in dark suits and officious manners, they interviewed Caleb and Margaret separately, took statements from the council, and examined the prisoners still locked in Red Hollow's small jail. The lead investigator, a thin man named Wallace with a pointed beard, was particularly interested in Caleb's past. You rode with Eli Calder, Wallace said, not bothering to frame it as a question. 5 years ago, briefly. Caleb kept his voice level. And when he was arrested for rustling, you were conveniently elsewhere. I'd left his employment 2 weeks prior. Convenient timing. Caleb's hands clenched beneath the table. I didn't know he was rustling until after I left. When I found out, I didn't cover for him. That's the truth. Wallace studied him for a long moment, and yet his brother blamed you enough to hunt you down and attack you. Rhett Calder blames the world for his brother's choices. That's not my problem. It became your problem when he showed up with guns. Yes, Caleb agreed. It did. Wallace made notes in a leather-bound book, his expression unreadable. The marshal will make the final determination, but based on the evidence and testimony, it appears you acted in self-defense. Miss Hale corroborates your account, as do the townsmen who arrived at the scene. Relief flooded through Caleb, but he kept his face neutral. So I'm clear? Of wrongdoing in this incident, yes. But understand, Deputy Vance, you're being watched. Any hint of impropriety, any association with criminal elements, and this will be revisited. It was a warning and a leash, and Caleb accepted it with a tight nod. Margaret's interview was shorter but no less pointed. Wallace wanted to know why she'd chosen to stay at the cabin, why she'd fought instead of hiding, and whether she'd been coerced. No one coerced me, she said firmly. I chose to fight because running would have meant dying. Deputy Vance gave me the tools to defend myself, and I used them. You could have fled when the town arrived. Why would I do that? Wallace's eyes narrowed. Some might say your attachment to Deputy Vance clouds your judgment. Margaret's temper flared. My judgment is perfectly clear, Mr. Wallace. Caleb Vance is an honorable man who was attacked by criminals seeking revenge for crimes he didn't commit. If that's difficult for you to understand, perhaps you should spend less time looking for conspiracies and more time listening to the people who were actually there. Wallace's expression turned to stone. Careful, Miss Hale. Defending him too vigorously might make people wonder about your motives. Let them wonder, she shot back. I know the truth, and so does this town. That's enough. The interview ended shortly after, and Margaret left feeling both vindicated and rattled. The implication had been clear. Her reputation was tied to Caleb's now, for better or worse. She found she didn't mind as much as she should have. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Margaret walked to the jailhouse. Caleb was outside, repairing a loose board on the porch, and he looked up in surprise when she approached. Margaret, something wrong? No, I just wanted to talk. He set down his hammer and gestured to the steps. They sat side by side, watching the town settle into evening quiet. Wallace questioned you, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he tried to suggest I was biased in your favor. You are. She turned to look at him. So are you. In mine. A smile ghosted across his face. Fair point. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Margaret said, I don't regret it. Any of it. The cabin, the fight, standing by you. I want you to know that. Caleb's voice was rough. You should. It's complicated your life. My life was already complicated. At least now it's complicated in a way that matters. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the walls he'd built around himself beginning to crack. I'm not good at this, he admitted, at letting people in, at trusting that they'll stay. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret said quietly, not unless you want me to. I don't. The words came out fierce, almost desperate. I don't want you to go. The confession hung between them, raw and vital. Margaret reached out and took his hand, and he let her, his fingers curling around hers with surprising gentleness. Then I'll stay, she said. And in that moment, on the steps of a frontier jailhouse under a sky full of stars, two people who'd been alone for far too long found something worth fighting for, each other. The storm had forced them together. Survival had forged them into allies. But this quiet, fragile thing growing between them, was a choice they were making together, one breath at a time. The next 2 weeks unfolded with a deceptive calm that should have warned them both. Spring was beginning to assert itself against winter's grip, the snow melting in muddy rivulets down Red Hollow's streets, icicles dripping from eaves like tears, and the first brave shoots of green pushing through the frozen earth. The town settled into a rhythm that included them now, no longer as outcasts but as fixtures in the daily life of the community. Margaret's classroom filled steadily. Parents who'd once pulled their children away now nodded respectfully when she passed. The Pritchard boys had become her unlikely champions, challenging anyone who dared speak ill of their teacher. Even August Perry, who'd opposed her from the beginning, begrudgingly admitted his daughter had learned more in 3 weeks than in the previous 6 months. Caleb wore his badge with quiet authority, breaking up saloon fights with minimal violence and resolving disputes with a fairness that surprised even him. The townspeople stopped crossing the street to avoid him. Samuel Briggs invited him to Sunday dinner. Children stopped running when they saw him coming. But beneath the surface, something restless churned. Caleb felt it in the way his hand drifted to his gun when strangers rode into town, in the dreams that woke him gasping in the small hours, in the constant awareness that Rhett Calder sat in Red Hollow's jail waiting for the marshal to arrive and seal his fate. Margaret felt it too, though she couldn't name it. A tension that lived in the space between what they'd survived and what they hadn't yet acknowledged. They saw each other daily now, brief conversations on the street, longer ones on the jailhouse steps after her students had gone home. They talked about everything except the thing that mattered most, what they were becoming to each other. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the gunfight, when the storm that had been gathering finally arrived. It started with a single rider appearing on the eastern road just as the sun began its descent. Caleb was making his evening rounds when he spotted the figure. A young man, maybe 20, riding hard on a lathered horse that looked ready to collapse. The rider pulled up in front of the jailhouse, dismounted with obvious effort, and nearly fell. Caleb caught him. "Easy, what's wrong?" The young man's eyes were wild with fear and exhaustion. "Deputy Vance? You Deputy Vance?" "I am." "Thank heaven. I rode from Copper Creek, been riding for 8 hours straight." He gulped air, his words tumbling out in a rush. "There's men coming, 5, maybe 6 of them, asking about you, about what happened here. They're saying Rhett Calder was family, and they're coming to settle accounts." Caleb's blood turned to ice. "When?" "They left Copper Creek this morning. They'll be here by nightfall, maybe sooner. I tried to get ahead of them, but—" He swayed and Caleb steadied him again. "You did good. Real good." Caleb's mind was already racing, calculating time and distance and odds. "Get to the boarding house. Mrs. Garrett will give you a room and a meal. Tell her I sent you." The young man nodded and stumbled away, leaving Caleb standing in the middle of the street with the weight of what was coming settling over him like a shroud. 6 men, armed and angry, coming for him. The smart thing would be to run, take his horse and disappear into the mountains, let them chase ghosts while he put distance between himself and Red Hollow. He'd done it before. Could do it again. But even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't. Running meant abandoning the badge, the town, the fragile trust he'd built. It meant abandoning Margaret. And that, he realized with sudden, crushing clarity, was the one thing he couldn't do. He turned and headed for the council hall at a dead run. Mayor Grant was in his office, going over ledgers by lamplight, when Caleb burst through the door. The mayor looked up sharply, saw Caleb's expression, and set down his pen. "What happened?" Caleb explained in terse sentences. The rider, the warning, the men coming for revenge. Grant's face darkened with each word. "How long do we have?" 2 hours, maybe less." Grant stood, his chair scraping back. "Then we prepare. Briggs, Lott, Hendricks, round them up. We'll need every man who can shoot." "No." Caleb's voice cut through the room like a blade. "This is my fight. I won't ask the town to bleed for it." "The hell you won't," Grant's eyes blazed. "You're wearing a badge now, Vance. That makes you one of us, and we don't abandon our own. These men aren't coming for the town. They're coming for me. And you're part of this town now, so they're coming for all of us." Grant moved toward the door, then paused. "You can accept help, or you can die alone and let them burn Red Hollow afterward. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. Within 30 minutes, the town was mobilizing. Briggs assembled a defense force, 12 men with rifles and the will to use them. Lott fortified the jailhouse, boarding up windows and creating firing positions. Women and children were moved to the church basement, the most defensible structure in town. Hendricks stationed lookouts on the rooftops. And through it all, Caleb felt the terrible weight of responsibility pressing down on him. These people were risking everything because he'd chosen to stand instead of run. If they died, their blood would be on his hands. Margaret found him as he was checking ammunition in the jailhouse. She stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined, and said, "I'm not going to the church." He looked up, and something fierce and protective surged through him. "Yes, you are." "No." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I fought beside you once. I'll do it again." "That was different. We were trapped. This time, you have a choice." "So do you. You chose to stay. I'm choosing the same thing." "Margaret," his voice cracked on her name. "I can't protect you if you're here." I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to let me stand with you. They stared at each other across the small room, and Caleb felt his resolve crumbling. He wanted to order her away, to lock her in the church if necessary, but he knew it would be pointless. She'd made up her mind, and nothing he said would change it. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said finally. "I'll take that as a compliment." She crossed to the gun rack and selected a rifle. "Show me how to use this properly. We don't have much time." So he did. They spent the next 20 minutes in the alley behind the jailhouse, Caleb teaching her to sight, breathe, and fire with the same patient intensity he'd shown in the cabin. She was a quick study, her hands steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. When she'd put 3 shots through a target at 50 yards, he nodded. "That'll do." She lowered the rifle and looked at him. "Caleb, if something happens, don't." He couldn't bear to hear her say it. "We're going to survive this. Both of us." "You can't promise that." "I can promise I'll fight like hell to make it true." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "When this is over, we need to talk. About us. About what this is." "I know what it is," she said softly. "Do you?" Before he could answer, a shout echoed from the street. "Riders coming! Eastern Road!" The moment shattered. Caleb grabbed his rifle and they ran. The sun was a blood-red smear on the horizon when the riders appeared. There were 7 of them, not 6. Hard men with guns and grievances, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. They rode in a loose formation, spreading out as they entered town, and Caleb's experienced eye cataloged them instantly. 2 with rifles across their saddles, 3 with pistols visible at their hips, 1 carrying a shotgun, and the leader, a thick-shouldered man with a scarred face, riding point, with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. They stopped in the middle of Main Street, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold air. The scarred man surveyed the town with eyes like chips of flint, taking in the boarded windows, the armed men positioned on rooftops and in doorways, the empty streets. He smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I'm looking for Caleb Vance," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "The man who got my cousin locked up and sentenced to hang." Caleb stepped out from behind the corner of the jailhouse, rifle held loose but ready. "I'm Vance." The scarred man's smile widened. "Name's Pike Calder. Rhett's my cousin. You know why I'm here?" "I can guess." "Then you know there's only one way this ends." "There are 2 ways," Caleb corrected. "You ride out now, or you die here. Your choice." Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You got sand, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered and outgunned. Look around, deputy. Your little town militia might have numbers, but half of them look like they've never fired a shot in anger. My boys, we've all got blood on our hands. This won't even be a fair fight." "Then leave," Mayor Grant called from his position near the general store. "You're not welcome here." "Wasn't asking permission, old man." Pike's hand drifted toward his gun. "This is between me and Vance. The rest of you can walk away. No reason for good folks to die over one man's sins." "That's where you're wrong." Samuel Briggs stepped into view, rifle shouldered. "Vance is one of us now. You want him, you go through all of us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the defenders. Pike's expression darkened. "That's how you want it? Fine. Blood's blood. We'll paint this whole damn town red." The world seemed to hold its breath. Caleb could feel the moment stretching, taut as a bowstring, and knew with absolute certainty that once it snapped, there would be no going back. "Wait." Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a bell. She stepped out of the jailhouse doorway, rifle in her hands, and walked to stand beside Caleb. "Before you start shooting, answer me this. Why?" Pike's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the woman your cousin tried to kill. I was there when he attacked the ranger station. I saw what kind of man he was." She held Pike's gaze without flinching. "So tell me, are you fighting because you believe Rhett was innocent, or because you're too proud to admit he got what he deserved?" The question landed like a physical blow. Pike's jaw worked, and for a moment something that might have been doubt flickered across his face. "My cousin is a violent criminal who attacked a lawman's station and tried to murder 2 people in cold blood," Margaret interrupted. "The territorial government investigated. The evidence was clear. Rhett Calder is guilty, and he's going to hang for it. That's justice, not revenge." "Justice?" Pike spat the word. Vance turned in my family. Caleb told the truth when asked a question, Margaret said firmly. That's not betrayal. That's integrity. Something your cousin clearly lacked. The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb could see Pike struggling, caught between pride and reason, between the demand for blood and the creeping realization that he might be in the wrong. But then one of Pike's men, a lean wolf of a man with dead eyes, shifted in his saddle and said, We didn't ride all this way to listen to some woman lecture us. We came for Vance. Let's finish it. The moment broke. Pike's hand dropped to his gun. Caleb fired first. The shot took Pike in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle. Then the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The Calder men returning fire, the townspeople shooting from their positions, bullets whining through the air and punching into wood and flesh. Caleb dove for cover, pulling Margaret with him behind a water trough. She came up shooting, her rifle cracking in controlled bursts, and he saw one of the attackers clutch his leg and tumble from his horse. Stay low, he shouted, but she was already moving, repositioning to get a better angle. The fight was brutal and close quarters. Two of Pike's men charged the general store, only to be driven back by concentrated fire from Briggs and Lott. Another tried to flank around the saloon and ran straight into Owen Hendricks, who put 2 bullets in his chest at point-blank range. Pike, bleeding but still in the fight, had taken cover behind a wagon and was directing his remaining men with sharp, practiced commands. They were losing, but they were making the town pay for every inch. Caleb saw the lean man with dead eyes circling toward the jailhouse, clearly trying to reach Rhett and free him. He snapped off a shot that missed, then another that caught the man in the hip. The man went down but kept crawling, determined. I've got him, Margaret said, and before Caleb could stop her, she was running in a crouch toward a better firing position. Margaret, no! But she was already moving. She reached the corner of the blacksmith shop, raised her rifle, and fired. The crawling man stopped moving. Then Pike saw her. Caleb watched in horror as Pike swung his pistol toward Margaret, his face twisted with rage. Time seemed to slow. Caleb was moving before he consciously decided to, throwing himself between Pike and Margaret just as the gun roared. The bullet hit him like a fist to the chest, driving the air from his lungs and spinning him around. He fell hard, the impact jarring his bones, and distantly heard Margaret screaming his name. Through graying vision, he saw her standing over him, firing again and again until her rifle clicked empty. Saw Pike stagger backward, blood blooming across his chest. Saw the remaining attackers breaking, running for their horses. Then everything went dark. When he came to, seconds or minutes later, he couldn't tell, Margaret was kneeling beside him, her hands pressed against his chest, her face wet with tears. Stay with me, she was saying, over and over like a prayer. Stay with me, Caleb. Don't you dare leave me now. He tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. The pain was immense, a white-hot agony that consumed everything. Doc Morrison appeared, shoving Margaret aside with surprising strength. Let me work. Everyone back. Hands lifted Caleb carried him. He caught glimpses. The darkening sky, Margaret's terrified face, the interior of the doctor's office. Then Morrison was cutting away his shirt, probing the wound with clinical efficiency. Bullet still in there, Morrison muttered. Missed the heart but nicked a lung. He's drowning in his own blood. Fix it! Margaret's voice was raw with desperation. I'm trying, damn it! Get me the probe and the sutures, and find me someone who can hold him down. This is going to hurt like hell. Caleb felt hands pinning his arms, his legs. Felt Morrison's probe entering the wound, searching for the bullet. The pain was beyond description, a tearing, burning agony that made him want to scream, but he couldn't breathe well enough to make a sound. Margaret's face appeared above him, her hands gripping his. Look at me. Just look at me. You're going to be fine. You hear me? You're going to be fine. He wanted to believe her, wanted it with a desperation that surprised him. But the darkness was closing in again, thick and smothering. Got it, Morrison said, and Caleb felt something shift inside him, a terrible wrong sensation. Now the hard part. If I can stop the bleeding. Time fractured. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, each return bringing fresh waves of pain. He heard voices, Morrison's terse commands, Margaret's whispered reassurances, Grant's gruff questions about the other wounded. At some point, the pain began to recede, replaced by a strange floating numbness. He opened his eyes and found Margaret still there, still holding his hand, her face gray with exhaustion. Hey, he managed, his voice a ruined whisper. Her eyes flew to his face. Hey, yourself. Did we win? Yes. She laughed, but it came out more like a sob. We won. Pike's dead. The others scattered or surrendered. It's over. Casualties? 3 wounded from the town, none dead. Her grip tightened on his hand. You were the worst. You stupid, heroic fool. You jumped in front of a bullet for me. Would do it again. I know. That's what terrifies me. She leaned down, her forehead touching his. Don't ever do that again, please. He wanted to promise, but they both knew it would be a lie. So instead he said, needed to talk, remember? This is not the time. Might not get another one. He struggled to focus through the fog of pain and whatever Morrison had given him. Need you to know, in case. In case what? In case I don't make it. You're going to make it, she said fiercely. Morrison says you'll live if you rest and don't do anything stupid. Still need to say it. He took a shallow breath, wincing. I love you, Margaret. Been trying not to, but I do. The words hung between them, stark and irrevocable. Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears. You idiot, she whispered. I love you too. That's why you can't die. I won't let you. He managed a weak smile, stubborn. You have no idea. She kissed his forehead gently. Now rest. Doctor's orders. Yes, ma'am. He closed his eyes, and this time when the darkness came, it was gentle. The next 3 days were a blur of fever and pain. Caleb's lung had been damaged, and Morrison fought to keep infection from setting in while the deputy's body struggled to heal. Margaret barely left his side, sleeping in a chair next to his bed and refusing all attempts to make her go home. The town rallied around them both. Mrs. Garrett brought food. The school children made cards decorated with crude drawings of Caleb wearing his badge. Even August Perry stopped by, awkward and gruff, to say that anyone willing to take a bullet for the school teacher was all right in his book. On the 3rd night, Caleb's fever broke. He woke to find Margaret asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still wrapped around his. The lamplight softened her features, and he spent a long moment just looking at her, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes, the determined set of her jaw even in sleep. She'd saved his life, not just by shooting Pike, but by giving him something worth living for. He squeezed her hand gently, and her eyes fluttered open. You're awake, she said, sitting up quickly. How do you feel? Like I got shot. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. How long? 3 days. Morrison says you're healing well, but you need to take it easy. No working, no writing, no heroics. Boring. Alive, she corrected. There's a difference. He studied her face and saw the toll the last few days had taken, the dark circles under her eyes, the new lines of worry around her mouth. You should rest. I've been resting. In a chair, not the same. I'm not leaving you. Margaret, no. Her voice was firm. You almost died saving my life. The least I can do is sit in an uncomfortable chair for a few days. He wanted to argue, but the stubborn light in her eyes told him it would be pointless. So instead he said, Thank you. For what? For staying, for fighting, for... He hesitated, then pushed forward. For loving me back. Her expression softened. That's not something you need to thank me for, Caleb. It just is. Still means everything to hear it. She leaned forward and kissed him, gently, carefully, mindful of his injuries. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. When you're healed, she said, we're going to have a very long conversation about what comes next. Looking forward to it. Good, because I have plans. Should I be worried? Probably. She settled back into her chair, her hand still wrapped around his. But I think you'll like them anyway. Outside, Red Hollow was settling into sleep. The jailhouse stood secure, its prisoner awaiting the marshal's justice. The wounded were mending, the dead were buried. And in Doc Morrison's small office, 2 people who'd been pushed together by necessity and circumstance were choosing each other with clear eyes and full hearts. The storm had passed. The battle was won. And what lay ahead, whatever challenges and choices awaited them, they would face together. Not as the outlaw and the schoolteacher, not as the deputy and the woman who'd saved him, but as something new, something forged in fire and tempered in trust. Something that looked remarkably like home. The gun smoke was still clearing when the first townspeople emerged from cover, their faces pale with shock and their rifles held in trembling hands. The street looked like a battlefield, bodies sprawled in the mud, blood staining the melting snow, and the acrid smell of burnt powder hanging heavy in the cold air. Pike Calder lay dead near the wagon where he'd taken his final stand, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. 2 of his men were dead beside him, another 3 wounded and groaning, and the rest had scattered into the wilderness where they'd face the wolves in the cold rather than capture. Mayor Grant moved through the scene with grim efficiency, directing men to tend the wounded and secure the prisoners. Samuel Briggs organized a group to search for the men who'd fled, though everyone knew they wouldn't get far in this weather without horses or supplies. Owen Hendricks stood guard over the captured outlaws, his rifle never wavering despite the exhaustion etched into his weathered face. But most eyes were on Doc Morrison's office, where lamplight spilled from the windows and shadows moved behind the curtains. Inside, Caleb Vance lay fighting for his life, and outside the town held its collective breath. Margaret sat in the corner of Morrison's examination room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd been moved there forcibly after the doctor had barked at her to get out of his way, but she'd refused to leave the building entirely. Blood covered her dress, Caleb's blood, and her hands still shook from the recoil of firing shot after shot until Pike had finally fallen. She'd killed a man, maybe more than one. The knowledge sat heavy in her stomach, but she couldn't bring herself to feel remorse. Not yet. Not when Caleb's labored breathing was the only sound that mattered in the entire world. Morrison worked with fierce concentration, his instruments gleaming in the lamplight as he probed the wound in Caleb's chest. The bullet had entered high on the left side, tearing through muscle and possibly nicking the lung before lodging near the shoulder blade. Every breath Caleb took bubbled wetly, and pink foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, signs Morrison recognized all too well from his war years. "Collapsed lung," he muttered to his assistant, a young man named Peter who'd apprenticed under him for 2 years. "We need to reinflate it, or he'll drown in his own blood." Peter's face went pale. "How?" "We improvise." Morrison grabbed a hollow reed from his collection of surgical instruments. He kept odd things, remnants from frontier medicine where anything could save a life, and sterilized it quickly in alcohol. "Hold him steady. This is going to hurt like hell, even unconscious." He made a small incision between Caleb's ribs and inserted the reed, angling it carefully. Air hissed out, blood-tinged and foul, and Caleb's body convulsed despite his unconscious state. Margaret heard the sound from the corner and bit down on her fist to keep from crying out. "Come on, son," Morrison breathed. "Fight. Don't you quit on me now." For endless minutes that felt like hours, Morrison worked to stabilize the lung while Peter tried to slow the bleeding from the entry wound. The floor grew slick with blood, and twice Morrison thought he'd lost the battle. But each time, Caleb's heart kept beating, stubborn, resilient, refusing to quit. Finally, when Morrison had done everything he could, he stepped back and wiped his forehead with a blood-stained sleeve. "He's alive. For now. The next 24 hours will tell us if he stays that way." Margaret was on her feet instantly. "Can I see him?" "In a minute. Let me get him bandaged and settled first." Morrison's voice gentled. "Mrs. Vance, I won't lie to you. He's in bad shape. The lung is holding for now, but infection is almost certain. If fever sets in, he'll fight it," Margaret said with fierce certainty. "He's too stubborn to die." Morrison's lips quirked despite the grim circumstances. "Let's hope you're right." He allowed her in once Caleb had been moved to the recovery cot and wrapped in clean bandages. She took the chair beside him immediately, reaching for his hand and holding it between both of hers. His skin was cold and clammy, his breathing shallow and wet-sounding, but his fingers twitched when she touched him. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here, and I'm not leaving. So you hold on, Caleb Vance. You hold on and you fight, because we're not done yet. We're nowhere near done." His eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. She kept talking anyway, pouring words into the silence. Reminders of everything they'd survived. Promises of everything still to come. Confessions of how much she needed him to stay. Outside, the town gathered in small groups to process what had happened. The fight had lasted less than 10 minutes, but its impact would ripple through Red Hollow for years to come. 3 townsmen had been wounded, none seriously, thank fortune, and the fact that no one from the town had died felt like a miracle they didn't quite deserve. Mayor Grant convened an emergency council meeting in the street, too urgent to wait for the hall. The 6 councilmen stood in a tight circle while anxious citizens pressed close to hear. "We need to send for the territorial marshal immediately," Grant said without preamble. "This is beyond our authority now. We've got dead outlaws, wounded prisoners, and a deputy fighting for his life. We need official support." "Agreed," Briggs said. "I'll ride to Copper Creek first light. It's a hard day's ride, but if I push, I can make it by evening." "Take someone with you," Lott suggested. "These hills aren't safe with Calder's men still loose." "I'll go," Owen Hendricks volunteered. "My horse is fresh, and I know the trail." Grant nodded. "Good. The rest of us need to secure the town. Double the watch tonight, armed patrols on every street. If any of those outlaws come back—" "They won't," August Perry interrupted. "They're either dead in the snow by now or running so fast they won't stop until they hit the next territory." "Probably," Grant agreed. "But we prepare anyway. This town just fought off a coordinated attack by armed criminals. That's going to draw attention, good and bad. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." The meeting dissolved into assignments and logistics, but beneath the practical planning ran a current of something else: pride. They'd stood together when it mattered. They'd defended their own. And they'd won. Inside the general store, Edna Frost was holding court with a group of women who'd gathered to process the shock. "Did you see the school teacher?" she said, her voice hushed with awe. "Standing there with a rifle, shooting like she was born to it. I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." "She saved Deputy Vance's life," another woman added. "Maybe twice. Shot Pike Calder when he had Vance dead to rights. And before that, she held the jailhouse flank," a third contributed. "My husband said she dropped 2 men who were trying to circle around. Cool as ice," he said. "Never hesitated." The women fell silent, reconsidering everything they'd thought they knew about the proud schoolteacher from Boston. She'd been easy to dismiss before. Too educated, too opinionated, too unwilling to know her place. But a woman who could stand in a gunfight and hold her ground? That commanded a different kind of respect. "We should do something for her," Edna said finally. "For both of them, after what they did for this town." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group, and by the time they dispersed, plans were already forming. The night stretched endlessly. Margaret refused to leave Caleb's side despite Morrison's gentle insistence that she needed rest. She dozed in the chair, jerking awake every time Caleb's breathing changed or he made a sound. Mrs. Garrett brought food that Margaret couldn't eat, and coffee that she drank mechanically, her eyes never leaving Caleb's pale face. Around midnight, his fever spiked. Margaret watched in helpless horror as his skin flushed hot and sweat soaked the bandages. Morrison appeared instantly, drawn by some sixth sense doctors developed, and began the grim work of trying to cool Caleb's burning body. "Ice!" he barked at Peter. "Get me every bit we have, and cold water, fresh from the well." They packed Caleb in ice and wet cloths, but the fever raged on. Margaret held his hand through it all, murmuring comfort even as terror clawed at her throat. This was the crisis Morrison had warned about, the moment when infection either took hold or the body fought it off. Everything hung in the balance. "Talk to him," Morrison said quietly. "Sometimes they can hear us. Even like this. Give him something to fight for." So Margaret leaned close and began to speak. She told him about the house she'd picked out, the one with the porch facing east to catch the sunrise. About the students who'd asked when he'd teach them to track game the way he'd promised Jake Pritchard. About the garden she wanted to plant in the spring, and how she'd need his help building the fence to keep the deer out. "You have to come back to me," she whispered fiercely, "because I already ordered lumber for that fence, and I'll be damned if I'm going to build it alone. And because I love you, Caleb. I love you so much it terrifies me, and I'm not ready to let you go. So you fight. You hear me? You fight." His fingers twitched in hers. His eyelids fluttered. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't believe it at first, the fever began to break. By dawn, Caleb's temperature had dropped to something close to normal. His breathing was still labored, but no longer wet and bubbling. The crisis had passed, though Morrison cautioned that infection could still set in, and they weren't out of danger yet. But Margaret saw the difference in the doctor's eyes, the cautious hope replacing grim determination. Caleb was going to live. She finally allowed herself to be led to a cot in the corner, and she fell into exhausted sleep, still holding Caleb's hand. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of voices. Blinking groggily, she sat up to find Caleb awake, truly awake. His gray eyes clear despite the pain she could see in the tightness around his mouth. "Hey," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Hey, yourself." She was at his side in an instant, her hands framing his face. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot." A ghost of his dry humor flickered through. "How long?" "A day and a half. You've been unconscious most of it." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "You scared me half to death, Caleb Vance." "Sorry." He tried to take a deeper breath and winced. "Pike?" "Dead. His men are either dead, captured, or fled. It's over." Relief washed over his features. "You? Are you hurt?" "Not a scratch. Thanks to you throwing yourself in front of bullets like an idiot. Would do it again." "I know." Her voice cracked. "That's what terrifies me." They stayed like that for a long moment, just looking at each other and acknowledging the truth they'd both been dancing around. They could have died. Either one of them, both of them. The fact that they hadn't felt less like skill and more like sheer stubborn luck. Morrison appeared, checking Caleb's bandages with efficient movements. "Fever's gone. Breathing's improved. You're not out of the woods yet, Deputy, but you're heading in the right direction. Keep this up and you might actually survive your first month on the job." "That's the plan," Caleb managed. "Good. Then follow my orders. No moving, no excitement, and absolutely no heroics for at least 2 weeks. Clear?" "Crystal." Morrison turned to Margaret. "He'll need constant care. I can keep him here, or—" "I'll take care of him," Margaret said immediately. "Whatever he needs." The doctor nodded, unsurprised. "Then we'll set up a recovery room at the boarding house. Mrs. Garrett's already volunteered. It'll be easier than keeping him here." Over the next few days, as Caleb slowly regained strength, Red Hollow began to show its gratitude in tangible ways. Food appeared at the boarding house in an endless stream, casseroles and pies and hearty stews that Mrs. Garrett accepted with knowing smiles. The schoolchildren made cards and drawings that covered the walls of Caleb's recovery room. Men stopped by to shake his hand and thank him for standing firm, but the most significant change was in how people looked at them. The whispers and speculation hadn't disappeared, but they'd transformed into something else, respect tinged with admiration and a grudging acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong about the outlaw and the schoolteacher. A week after the gunfight, when Caleb was finally able to sit up for longer periods, Mayor Grant requested a meeting. Margaret helped Caleb into a chair on Mrs. Garrett's sun-drenched porch, and Grant arrived with the entire council in tow. "We won't keep you long," Grant began, settling into the chair across from them. "But there are things that need saying." Caleb and Margaret exchanged glances. "All right," Caleb said cautiously. Grant cleared his throat. "This town owes you both an apology. We judged you before we knew you, made assumptions based on rumors and fear. When we sent you to that ranger station, it was because we didn't know what else to do with you. We saw you as problems to be managed, not people to be valued." "That's in the past," Margaret started, but Grant held up a hand. "Let me finish. You could have run when the Calders came. Hell, you should have run. It would have been the smart thing to do. But you stayed. You fought for a town that had given you nothing but suspicion and cold shoulders. And when the attack came here, you both stood on that street and bled for us." His voice roughened. "That demands acknowledgement." Samuel Briggs spoke up. "The territorial marshal arrived yesterday. He's reviewed the evidence, interviewed witnesses, and examined the bodies. His official report states that Deputy Vance and Mrs. Vance acted in lawful defense of Red Hollow against armed outlaws. There will be no charges, no investigation. You're both cleared." Relief flooded through Margaret so powerfully it left her dizzy. She'd been so focused on keeping Caleb alive that she hadn't let herself worry about the legal aftermath. But the marshal's clearance meant no questions, no doubts cast on their actions. "There's more," Lott added. "The council voted unanimously last night. We're offering Deputy Vance a permanent position as Red Hollow's chief lawman. Salary of $40 a month, housing provided, full authority to hire deputies as needed." Caleb blinked. "Chief lawman? The territory's growing," Grant explained. "Red Hollow's growing. We need someone who can handle what's coming. More people. more problems, more situations like what we just faced. You've proven you can do that. The badge is yours if you want it. It was a stunning offer. Security, legitimacy, a future in a place that had once viewed him with suspicion. Caleb looked at Margaret, reading the question in his eyes. She gave the smallest nod, her hand finding his. I accept, Caleb said. On one condition. Name it. Miss Hale keeps her teaching position with full support from the council. No more parents pulling kids out of school, no more undermining her authority. She's earned the right to do her job without interference. Already done, Perry said, and there was actual warmth in his voice. My daughter hasn't stopped talking about how brave Miss Hale was. Says she wants to be just like her when she grows up. I figure if the school teacher's that good a role model, she deserves our support. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. Don't thank us yet, Grant said with a slight smile. The Pritchard boys are still terrors, and you'll have your hands full come fall when the new families arrive. But you'll have the resources you need and the respect you've earned. The meeting concluded with handshakes and gratitude, and when the councilmen had left, Caleb and Margaret sat together on the porch in the warm afternoon sun. We did it, Margaret said softly. We actually did it. Did what? Changed their minds, proved them wrong, made a place for ourselves here. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his hand wrapped around hers. Couldn't have done it without you, any of it. We did it together. That's the only way it works. They sat in companionable silence, watching Red Hollow go about its business. Children played in the street, merchants swept their storefronts, and life continued in the ordinary, extraordinary way it always had. But something fundamental had shifted. The town that had once pushed them to the margins had pulled them into the center, and the two people who'd been outcasts were now pillars of the community. Over the following weeks, as Caleb continued to heal and resume his duties, the truth of their new status became increasingly clear. People sought Caleb's advice on disputes and asked Margaret's opinion on town matters. They were invited to dinners and gatherings, included in decisions that shaped Red Hollow's future. The house Margaret had chosen was purchased by the town council and deeded to Caleb as part of his compensation. She spent her free hours transforming it from an empty shell into a home, painting walls, hanging curtains, filling rooms with furniture donated or purchased from grateful townspeople. Caleb helped when Morrison allowed it, though he was still limited in what he could do physically. He built shelves for Margaret's growing collection of books, repaired the porch railing, and started work on the fence she'd mentioned during his fever. Working together in the evenings became their routine, a quiet domesticity that felt both foreign and perfectly natural. One evening, as they sat on their new porch watching the sunset, Caleb said, I've been thinking. Dangerous habit, Margaret teased, about us, about what comes next. He turned to face her fully. I know we haven't known each other long. 6 weeks isn't much time to build a life on. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I don't want to wait anymore. Margaret's heart began to race. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to marry you. Make this official. Build a life together that's about choice, not circumstances. He pulled something from his pocket, a simple silver ring with a small blue stone. It's not much. Samuel helped me make it in his forge. The stone's from a stream up near the ranger station, but it's perfect. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. And yes, he blinked. I haven't asked yet. You were going to, and the answer is yes. She held out her hand and he slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes to all of it. He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise, and Margaret felt the last piece of her guard fall away. She'd come to Red Hollow expecting isolation and had found partnership. She'd been forced into proximity with a dangerous stranger and had discovered the man she wanted to spend her life with. The town learned of their engagement the next day, and the reaction was unanimously positive. Mrs. Garrett immediately began planning a wedding celebration. The church ladies argued cheerfully over who would make the cake. Even Edna Frost, who'd been among the first to gossip about the impropriety of them sharing that cabin, declared it the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a crisp autumn morning with the whole town in attendance. Margaret wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that Mrs. Garrett had helped her sew, and Caleb wore his best shirt with the deputy's badge pinned over his heart. They spoke their vows in the small church where Margaret had once slept in the basement, and when Reverend Cole pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause. The celebration afterwards spilled through the streets of Red Hollow, food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Caleb and Margaret moved through it all in a daze of happiness, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who months earlier had wanted nothing to do with them. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, they slipped away to their home, truly theirs now, a sanctuary built from choice and effort and love. They stood in the small parlor, hands clasped, and let the reality of what they'd built settle over them. "We're married," Margaret said, wonder in her voice. "We're married," Caleb agreed, pulling her close. "And we're staying. We're staying." It was both a statement and a promise. They'd survived the storm that brought them together, the violence that tested them, and the judgment that tried to break them. And they'd emerge stronger, bound not by necessity, but by love deliberately chosen. Outside, Red Hollow settled into sleep. Inside, two people who'd been strangers 2 months ago began building the foundation of a life that would last decades. They'd been pushed together by circumstance, forged by survival, and transformed by trust into something neither had expected but both had needed. The outlaw who wasn't an outlaw had found redemption and purpose. The schoolteacher who wouldn't bend had found partnership and home. And together, they'd proven that sometimes the worst circumstances create the best outcomes, that strength comes in forms beyond physical courage, and that love, real love, is a choice made every day, in big moments and small. The town that had once seen them as problems to be solved now saw them as proof that people could change, that second chances mattered, and that the courage to stand together against impossible odds was worth celebrating. Caleb and Margaret Vance had found their place in Red Hollow, not by fitting into the mold the town expected, but by breaking it entirely and creating something new. They'd faced wolves and outlaws and survived, but more than that, they'd faced the challenge of being seen, truly seen, by another person and choosing vulnerability over safety. And in a hard land where survival was never guaranteed and kindness was often scarce, they'd built something rare and precious, a partnership of equals, a love forged in fire, and a home that welcomed them both exactly as they were. The storm had ended, the battles were won, and what lay ahead was the quiet, profound work of living, together, always together, in the town that had finally learned to see them for who they truly were. The marshal arrived on a cold morning 2 weeks after the gunfight, riding into Red Hollow with 4 deputies and the weight of territorial law behind him. Marshal Benjamin Cross was a tall man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence to be impressed by small-town heroics. He dismounted in front of the jailhouse, surveyed the bullet-scarred buildings with a practiced gaze, and asked to speak with Deputy Vance. Caleb met him on the jailhouse steps, still moving carefully because of his healing wound. The stitches had come out 3 days earlier, but Doc Morrison had been adamant about limiting physical activity for at least another month. Margaret stood beside him, not behind, never behind, her presence a quiet statement that they came as a pair now. Cross studied them both with those sharp eyes. "You the ones who held off 7 armed men?" "We had help," Caleb said. "The whole town stood with us." "So I heard." Cross pulled a folded document from his coat. "I've got statements from Wallace's investigation, testimony from your prisoners, and letters from half the town council singing your praises. Seems you've made quite an impression, Deputy Vance." "Just doing my job, Marshal." "Your job?" Cross's expression was unreadable. "You've been wearing that badge less than a month, and you've already been involved in 2 major incidents. Some might call that bad luck. Others might call it a pattern." Margaret stiffened, but Caleb's voice remained steady. "I'd call it dealing with unfinished business. Rhett Calder came looking for revenge over something that happened 5 years ago. His cousin followed. Neither of them were willing to let the law handle it. And now they're both dead or locked up, and you're standing here with a hole in your chest." Cross folded the document and tucked it away. "I've seen men like you before, Vance. Men running from their past who think a badge will give them a fresh start. Sometimes it works. More often, the past catches up anyway. Is there a point to this, Marshal?" Margaret's tone was cool but controlled. Cross turned his attention to her. "You're the schoolteacher. The one who shot 2 men during the fight. I defended myself in this town. I'd do it again. I believe you would. Something that might have been respect flickered across Cross's face. You've got steel, Miss Hale. More than most men I know. He looked back at Caleb. Which is why I'm going to make you an offer instead of running you out of town. Caleb's jaw tightened. What kind of offer? The territorial governor wants to establish a proper law enforcement presence in these frontier towns. Too many settlements operating without oversight. Too many problems slipping through the cracks. He's authorizing me to recruit deputies with local knowledge and proven capability. Cross paused. You've proven both. I'm offering you a permanent appointment as deputy marshal for this district, with Red Hollow as your base of operations. $50 a month, plus expenses. You'd report directly to me, but you'd have full authority to handle law enforcement across 4 counties. The offer hung in the cold air, massive and unexpected. Caleb felt Margaret's hand find his, her fingers lacing through his in silent support. And if I refuse? He asked quietly. Then you turn in your badge and I find someone else. But I think that would be a waste. Cross's expression softened slightly. I've read the reports, Vance. I know what you did. You could have run when Calder came for you. Should have, if you were smart. Instead, you stood your ground and protected people. That's what good lawmen do. We need more of that, not less. Caleb looked at Margaret, reading the question in her eyes. This wasn't a decision he could make alone anymore. Whatever he chose would affect both of them. Can I have some time to think about it? He asked. 24 hours, Cross said. After that, I need an answer. I've got circuit rounds to make and paperwork that won't file itself. He tipped his hat to Margaret. Ma'am, pleasure meeting you. He strode away toward the hotel, leaving them standing on the steps in the pale morning light. $50 a month, Margaret said softly. That's more than we both make combined. It's also dangerous, more dangerous than what I'm doing now. Caleb turned to face her fully. 4 counties is a lot of territory. I'd be gone for weeks at a time, chasing outlaws, serving warrants, dealing with the kind of men who don't go quietly. I know. And you'd be here alone, teaching, managing on your own, waiting for me to come back. If I come back. Her hand tightened on his. I know that too. But I also know you, Caleb. This is what you're good at, what you were meant to do. I won't be the reason you turn away from that. You wouldn't be the reason. You'd be the choice. He cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. I love you, Margaret, more than I thought I could love anyone. And if taking this job means risking what we have, it doesn't, she interrupted. What we have isn't that fragile. We survived a blizzard, a wolf attack, and 2 gunfights. I think we can survive you doing the work you're meant to do. You make it sound simple. It is simple. You're a good man who wants to make a difference. This job lets you do that on a scale bigger than one small town. How could I stand in the way of that? He kissed her then, right there on the jailhouse steps where anyone could see, and she kissed him back with a fierce certainty that erased any remaining doubt. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb said, I have conditions. For the job? For us. He took both her hands in his. I take the marshal's offer, but we do this right. I court you proper. No more hiding, no more dancing around what we are. I want the whole town to know you're mine and I'm yours. Margaret's smile was radiant. I think they already know, but I appreciate the sentiment. What else? When I'm gone, you have people watching out for you. Briggs, Morrison, Mrs. Garrett. I need to know you're not alone. Done. Anything else? He hesitated, then plunged forward. When I get back from my first circuit, I'm going to ask you to marry me. I'm telling you now so you have time to think about your answer. Her breath caught. Caleb, you don't have to say anything now. Just think about it, about what it would mean. A lawman's wife doesn't have an easy life. Neither does a school teacher, she pointed out. But I've never run from hard things, and I'm not starting now. She rose on her toes and kissed him softly. Ask me when you get back. I'll have an answer ready. Should I be worried about what it'll be? Her eyes danced with mischief and promise. I guess you'll have to come back and find out. They stood there wrapped in each other, the future spreading before them vast and uncertain and full of possibility, until Doc Morrison emerged from his office across the street and shouted, "Deputy Vance! You're supposed to be resting, not canoodling on the steps like a schoolboy." Margaret laughed, the sound bright and free, and Caleb realized he'd never heard her laugh like that before, without guardedness or restraint, just pure joy. He wanted to spend the rest of his life finding ways to make her laugh like that. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "The children will be arriving soon, and I promise to review their arithmetic." "Tonight?" he asked. "Dinner at the boarding house, Mrs. Garrett makes a decent pot roast on Thursdays. I'd like that." She squeezed his hands once more, then turned and walked toward the schoolhouse, her spine straight and her head high. Caleb watched her go, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him settle more comfortably now. He knew what his answer would be. He'd known from the moment Cross made the offer. But first there was one more conversation he needed to have. He found Mayor Grant in the general store negotiating the price of nails with Edna Frost. Grant looked up when Caleb entered and excused himself from the transaction. "Marshall made his offer, I take it," Grant said without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because Cross and I had a long conversation last night about what kind of man you are and what this town needs. I may have written a letter of recommendation to the territorial governor. Several of us did." Caleb stared at him. "You recommended me?" "Damned right I did. You're wasted as a town deputy, Vance. You've got the skills and the temperament for something bigger." Grant's expression grew serious. "But I'll be honest. If you take that job, it'll be hard on Red Hollow. Hard on Miss Hale most of all. Are you prepared for that?" "I think so. We talked about it." "And?" "She told me to take the job. Said she wouldn't stand in the way of me doing what I'm meant to do." Grant nodded slowly. "She's a remarkable woman. Don't lose her, Vance." "I don't plan to, sir." Caleb met the mayor's eyes squarely. "I'm going to marry her, if she'll have me." A smile cracked Grant's weathered face. "About time someone made an honest declaration. Half the town's been speculating about you two since the ranger station incident." "Let them speculate. They'll know the truth soon enough." Caleb shifted his weight, still favoring his injured side. "I wanted to thank you, Mayor, for giving me a chance when you had every reason not to, for standing by me when the Calders came, for everything. You earned it, son, every bit of it." Grant extended his hand and Caleb shook it firmly. "Now go tell Cross you're taking the job before he rides off and finds someone less qualified." Caleb left the store and headed for the hotel, his decision made and his future taking shape in ways he'd never imagined possible 6 weeks ago. Marshall Cross was in the hotel dining room, working his way through a plate of eggs and bacon when Caleb found him. He looked up, read Caleb's expression, and nodded. "You're taking it?" "Yes, sir. On one condition." Cross set down his fork. "Which is?" "I need 2 weeks before I start circuit rounds. I've got a bullet wound that needs more healing, and I've got personal business to settle here first. The school teacher." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "Yes, sir. Margaret Hale. I intend to marry her, and I need time to do things proper before I leave." Cross studied him for a long moment, then nodded. 2 weeks. Use them well. After that, I'll expect you in Copper Creek for orientation and assignment. We'll start you on the Southern Circuit, mostly small towns, claim disputes, occasional horse theft. Nothing too dangerous while you're still mending." "Thank you, Marshal." "Don't thank me yet. This job has a way of testing a man in ways he doesn't expect, and it'll test your relationship too. Make sure Miss Hale understands what she's signing up for." "She does," Caleb said with quiet confidence. "She's stronger than anyone gives her credit for." "I believe it. She'd have to be to take on a man like you." Cross returned his attention to his breakfast. "Welcome to the Territorial Marshal Service, Deputy Vance. Try not to get shot again in your first month." Caleb left the hotel feeling lighter than he had in years, the future suddenly bright with promise instead of shadowed by his past. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a dream. Caleb and Margaret made their relationship public in the quiet, deliberate way of people who'd already weathered enough drama to last a lifetime. They attended town gatherings together, took evening walks through Red Hollow's muddy streets, and sat side by side at Sunday services while the congregation whispered and speculated and ultimately approved. Mrs. Garrett became their unlikely champion, hosting dinners at the boarding house and making pointed comments about what a fine couple they made. The Pritchard boys appointed themselves Margaret's protectors whenever Caleb was busy with deputy duties, a role they took with comical seriousness. Even August Perry grudgingly admitted they seemed well suited. But beneath the normalcy, both of them felt time ticking away. 2 weeks wasn't nearly long enough to say everything that needed saying, to build the foundation of what they were trying to create. So they made every moment count. On the 10th day, Caleb took Margaret to the ranger station, the place where everything had changed. The cabin stood quiet and weathered, the snow around it melting in patches to reveal brown earth and the first brave shoots of spring grass. They stood on the porch where they'd fought off wolves and watched the sunset behind the distant mountains. "I keep thinking about that first night," Margaret said quietly. "How terrified I was. Of you, of the storm, of everything." "I was terrified too," Caleb admitted. "Just better at hiding it. You thought I'd be a burden. I thought you'd be fragile. Turns out you're made of iron wrapped in silk." She laughed. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. I'm not good with words. You're better than you think." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "When you leave for Copper Creek, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Come back. No matter how dangerous it gets, no matter what happens out there, you find a way to come back to me." The intensity in her voice stole his breath. "I promise. And I promise to be here when you do. Teaching, building a life, waiting." Her smile was tremulous. "We're going to make this work, Caleb. Against all odds and common sense, we're going to build something lasting." "I believe you." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and feeling her warmth seep into his bones. "I believe in us." They stood there as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two people who'd been pushed together by circumstance and had chosen to stay together by will, and the future stretched before them full of challenge and promise in equal measure. On the 13th day, Caleb rode out to the Territorial Marshal's office in Copper Creek for orientation. Marshal Cross spent 6 hours drilling him on jurisdiction, legal procedures, and the intricate politics of frontier law enforcement. He met the other deputies, hard men with scars and stories, and felt the weight of what he was joining settle over him. But he also felt a rightness he'd never experienced before. This was work that mattered, work that would let him use his skills for something more than survival. He rode back to Red Hollow that evening as the stars emerged and found Margaret waiting on the jailhouse steps despite the cold. "How was it?" she asked. "Overwhelming, exciting, terrifying. So normal then." He laughed and sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "I leave in 2 days. First circuit takes 3 weeks, maybe 4. "I know." Her voice was steady despite the pain he heard beneath it. "We knew this was coming." "Doesn't make it easier." "No," she agreed. "But nothing worth having is easy." They sat in silence for a while, watching Red Hollow settle into sleep around them. Finally, Caleb said, "I have something for you." He pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and handed it to her. Margaret opened it carefully and gasped. Inside was a ring, simple silver with a small blue stone set in the center. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, but crafted with clear care. "It's not much," Caleb said, suddenly nervous. "Samuel Briggs helped me make it in his forge. The stone's from a stream up near the ranger station. I know I said I'd wait until I got back to ask, but I realized I didn't want to leave without you knowing." "Yes." Margaret's voice was thick with tears. He blinked. "I haven't asked yet." "I know, but the answer is yes. To whatever you were going to ask, yes." He took the ring from the box with shaking hands and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Margaret Hale," he said formally, his voice rough with emotion, "will you marry me? Will you take on a lawman who'll be gone more than he's home, who comes with a complicated past and an uncertain future, who'll probably drive you crazy with worry, but who loves you more than he thought it was possible to love anyone?" "Yes," she said again, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes to all of it, the worry and the waiting and the uncertain future. Yes to building something with you that's bigger than either of us alone. Yes to being your wife and your partner and the person you come home to." He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, they were both grinning like fools. "We should tell people," Margaret said breathlessly. "Tomorrow. Tonight, let's just be." So they sat on the jailhouse steps under a sky full of stars, her hand in his, the ring gleaming on her finger, and let themselves simply exist in the perfect moment before everything changed. The next day, word of their engagement spread through Red Hollow like wildfire. Reactions ranged from genuine happiness to knowing nods to a few sour expressions from those who'd hoped Margaret might aim higher than a deputy marshal with a questionable past. But the overall sentiment was positive, and by evening, Mrs. Garrett had organized an impromptu celebration at the boarding house. The parlor was packed with townspeople who'd come to congratulate them and speculate about wedding plans. Margaret fielded questions with grace while Caleb stood slightly behind her, overwhelmed by the attention but grateful for the community's acceptance. Mayor Grant raised a glass of whiskey and called for quiet. "I've known Caleb Vance less than 2 months," he began, "but in that time I've seen him prove himself a dozen times over. He's fought for this town, bled for it, and earned his place among us. And Margaret Hale? Well, she's been teaching our children and showing us what true strength looks like since the day she arrived." "Hear, hear," someone called out. Grant continued. "Watching them find each other has been a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances. They were thrown together by necessity and chose each other out of love. That's the kind of foundation that lasts." He raised his glass higher. "To Caleb and Margaret. May their life together be long, happy, and considerably less eventful than the past 2 months." Laughter and applause filled the room. Caleb felt Margaret's hand find his and squeeze tight. Later, when the crowd had thinned and they found themselves alone on the boarding house porch, Margaret said, "I've been thinking about the wedding." "Already?" Caleb was only half teasing. "We don't have much time before you leave. I don't want to wait months to marry you." His heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying let's do it before you go. Small and simple, just us and whoever wants to witness it. We can have a bigger celebration when you come back, but I want to be your wife when you ride out, not just your fiancé." The idea took root immediately, feeling absolutely right. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow." Her smile was brilliant. "Unless you think that's too fast." "I think we've already waited long enough." He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Let's do it. Let's get married tomorrow." The wedding took place the next afternoon in the small church where Margaret had once slept in the basement. The building was packed with townspeople who'd rearranged their schedules to attend, and Reverend Cole performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Garrett had helped her alter overnight. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt and the badge that represented his future. They stood before the altar, hands clasped, and spoke vows that were both traditional and deeply personal. "I promise to love you in absence and presence," Caleb said, his voice steady. "To trust you with the truth of who I am, scars and all. To come home to you whenever I can, and to carry you in my heart when I can't." "I promise to stand beside you, not behind you," Margaret replied, her eyes bright. "To build a life we can both be proud of, to wait for you with patience and welcome you with joy. To be your partner in all things, now and always." Reverend Cole pronounced them husband and wife, and when Caleb kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration afterward was brief but heartfelt. There was food and music and toasts, and through it all, Caleb and Margaret moved together in perfect synchrony, a unit already despite being married for less than an hour. As evening approached and the party began to wind down, Marshal Cross pulled Caleb aside. "I'm heading back to Copper Creek at first light. You'll follow tomorrow?" "Yes, sir. I need one more night." Cross glanced at Margaret, who was talking with Mrs. Garrett across the room, and nodded. "Take it. But be at the marshal's office by noon day after tomorrow. Your first assignment will be waiting. I'll be there." That night, in the small room at the boarding house that Mrs. Garrett had decorated with wildflowers and given them as a wedding gift, Caleb and Margaret finally had time alone. They sat on the narrow bed, fingers intertwined, and let the reality of what they'd done settle over them. "We're married," Margaret said, wonder in her voice. "We're married," Caleb agreed. "I'm Margaret Vance now." He tested the sound of it. "Margaret Vance, I like it." "So do I." She turned to face him fully. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not running when you had the chance. For staying and fighting and choosing this, choosing us, even when it would have been easier to walk away." "Thank you for the same thing," he said quietly. "For seeing who I could be instead of who people said I was. For standing with me when you had every reason to run." She cupped his face in her hands. "We're going to make this work, Caleb Vance. this marriage, this life, all of it. I don't know exactly how, but I know we will. I believe you. He leaned his forehead against hers. I believe in you, in us. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing together, finding their rhythm as partners in a way that went beyond words or vows. Then Margaret smiled, that brilliant, fearless smile he loved, and pulled him down to her, and they spent their wedding night building the foundation of their future in whispered promises and shared joy. The next morning arrived far too soon. Caleb packed his saddlebags while Margaret made coffee, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of people trying to memorize every detail of a moment they knew would end. Red Hollow was still asleep when they walked to the stable together. The sorrel mare was already saddled. Caleb had done it the night before, unable to sleep, and she nickered softly when they approached. 3 weeks, Caleb said, checking the saddle straps one more time. 4 at most. Then I'll be back. I'll be here. Margaret's voice was steady, but he could see the effort it cost her. Teaching, managing the house, probably driving Mrs. Garrett crazy with questions about cooking. You'll be fine. I know. So will you. She straightened his collar unnecessarily, her fingers lingering. Just remember your promise. Come back to you, always. He pulled her close, holding her tight enough that he could feel her heartbeat against his chest. I love you, Margaret Vance. I love you too. She pulled back just enough to look at his face. Now go, before I change my mind and make you stay. He kissed her, long and deep and full of everything he didn't have words for, then mounted the mare. Margaret stepped back, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. Caleb? She called as he gathered the reins. Yeah? When you come back, I'll have the house ready. Our house. Briggs found a place on the edge of town, small but sturdy. We'll make it a home. His throat tightened. I can't wait to see it. Then ride safe, Marshal Vance, and come back to me. He touched his fingers to his hat brim in salute, then turned the mare toward the road leading out of Red Hollow. He didn't look back, knew if he did, he'd never leave, but he carried the image of her standing there, brave and beautiful in his, all through the long ride to Copper Creek. The weeks that followed were harder than either of them anticipated. Caleb's first circuit took him through 5 small towns, dealing with everything from claim disputes to cattle rustling to a tense standoff with a group of miners who'd taken the law into their own hands. He wrote to Margaret every few days, brief letters full of mundane details, and the occasional admission of how much he missed her. Margaret threw herself into teaching and transforming the small house Briggs had found into a home. She painted walls, planted a garden, and filled the rooms with furniture purchased or bartered from townspeople who were happy to help the new marshal's wife. The Pritchard boys helped her move furniture. Mrs. Garrett taught her to cook beyond basic survival, and slowly the house became a place that felt like theirs. But the nights were long and quiet, and more than once Margaret woke from nightmares of Caleb lying bleeding in the snow, unable to reach him. She confided in Mrs. Garrett one evening over tea. I knew it would be hard. I just didn't expect it to hurt quite this much. That's love, dear, Mrs. Garrett said gently. The real kind. The kind that carves itself into your bones and makes you vulnerable in ways you never were before. Does it get easier? Easier to bear, yes. The missing never really goes away. You just learn to carry it better. She patted Margaret's hand. But when he comes home, all of this will be worth it. You'll see. Margaret wanted to believe her. Some days she did. Other days she simply endured, marking time until Caleb's return. On the 23rd day, a rider came to the schoolhouse during afternoon lessons. He dismounted quickly, his face urgent, and Margaret's heart stopped. Mrs. Vance, I've got a message from Marshal Cross. She stepped outside, her hands shaking. What is it? Deputy Vance was injured 3 days ago. Took a knife wound breaking up a fight in Silver Creek. Marshal says it's not life-threatening, but they're keeping him there another week to heal. Relief and fear warred in Margaret's chest. Where's Silver Creek? 2 days' ride northeast. I need to go to him. The rider hesitated. Ma'am, the marshal said to tell you Deputy Vance specifically requested you not come. Said he doesn't want you traveling that far alone, and he'll be back as soon as Doc clears him. Margaret's jaw set. She thanked the rider, dismissed her students early, and went straight to Mayor Grant's office. I need to borrow a horse, she said without preamble. And I need someone to watch the school for a week. Grant looked up from his paperwork. You're going after him. Yes. Even though he specifically asked you not to. Especially because of that. He's hurt and alone and probably worried I'll be furious that he got injured again. She met Grant's eyes squarely. I'm going, Mayor. The only question is whether I go with help or without it. Grant studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Samuel Briggs was planning to ride to Silver Creek anyway. He's got business with the assayer there. He leaves tomorrow morning. You can travel with him. Thank you. Margaret? Grant's voice stopped her at the door. He's lucky to have you. I hope he knows that. He does, she said softly. And I'm lucky to have him, even when he's being a stubborn fool about accepting help. The ride to Silver Creek took 2.5 days through country that was beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Briggs proved to be good company, quiet but steady, with stories about the territory's early days that made the miles pass faster. They arrived in Silver Creek at dusk on the 3rd day, and Briggs directed her to the small clinic where Caleb was recovering. Margaret found him sitting up in a narrow bed, his torso wrapped in fresh bandages, arguing with a harried-looking doctor about when he could leave. I'm fine, Caleb was insisting. It was barely a scratch. It was 6 inches of blade that nearly punctured your kidney, the doctor shot back. You're staying put until... He noticed Margaret in the doorway and stopped. Ma'am, can I help you? Caleb's head snapped around, his eyes going wide. Margaret? What are you doing here? She crossed to his bedside in 3 quick strides and kissed him hard enough to make him wince. When she pulled back, her eyes were blazing. I'm being your wife, she said firmly, which means when you get stabbed, I come check on you. Did you really think I'd just sit in Red Hollow and wait? I thought I didn't want you to worry. Too late. I've been worried sick since the writer brought news. She sat on the edge of the bed, her anger melting into relief. Are you really all right? I really am. Doc's just being cautious. Doc is being sensible, the doctor corrected, and your wife has more sense than you do. Listen to her. He headed for the door, then paused. I'll give you two some privacy. Try not to tear your stitches, deputy. When they were alone, Caleb reached up and touched Margaret's face. You rode for 3 days. 2.5. Briggs knows the shortcuts. You didn't have to come. Yes, I did. Because you're my husband and I love you and I needed to see with my own eyes that you're going to be fine. She covered his hand with hers. And because our house is ready, and I wanted to tell you in person that I'm tired of sleeping there alone. I want you home, Caleb, as soon as you're healed enough to travel. His expression softened into something tender and awed. You came all this way just to tell me that? I came all this way because I missed you. And because I wanted you to know that no matter where your job takes you, no matter how far you have to go or how long you're gone, you'll always have a home to come back to. With me. He pulled her down for another kiss, this one gentle and full of promise. I'm sorry for worrying you, for getting hurt again. You can't help what happens out there, but you can let me be part of it. The worry and the waiting and the coming to find you when you're hurt. That's what partners do. Partners, he repeated, testing the word. I like that better than just husband and wife. We're both, she said. All of it. Everything we need to be for each other. They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing together, finding their center again after weeks apart. When Margaret finally pulled back, she was smiling. Now tell me everything. What happened? How did you get stabbed? And don't leave out the details just because you think they'll worry me. So he told her about the claim dispute that had escalated into violence, the fight he'd broken up, the drunk miner who'd pulled a knife and gotten lucky. She listened without interrupting, her hand wrapped around his, and when he finished, she simply nodded. You did good work, she said. Dangerous work, but good. Is this going to be all right? The question came out raw, vulnerable. Me doing this job, being gone, coming back hurt sometimes. Can we really make this work? Margaret looked at him with absolute certainty in her eyes. Yes, because we're not doing it alone anymore. We're doing it together, and there's nothing we can't handle if we face it side by side. He believed her, not because it would be easy, but because she made him believe in possibilities he'd never dared imagine before. A week later, they rode back to Red Hollow together, Caleb still moving carefully, but healing well. Margaret beside him, and Briggs trailing behind with an amused smile. The town welcomed them home with genuine warmth, and for the first time Caleb felt like he truly belonged somewhere. The house Margaret had prepared was everything she'd promised, small but sturdy, with flowers blooming in the front yard and curtains in the windows and a home-cooked meal waiting on the stove. They spent that first evening walking through each room, Margaret pointing out what she'd done and what she still wanted to do, and Caleb feeling overwhelmed by the simple gift of it all. "You did this," he said, standing in what would be their bedroom. "You built this for us." "We'll finish it together," she corrected. "But yes, I got it started. Because I wanted you to know you have a place that's yours. Not just a room behind a jailhouse, but a real home." He kissed her, pouring every ounce of gratitude and love into it, and she responded with equal intensity. That night, lying in their own bed in their own house with Margaret curled against his side, Caleb felt something he'd been chasing his entire life finally settle into place. Peace. The months that followed established a pattern. Caleb would ride out on circuit for 3 or 4 weeks, handling law enforcement across the 4 counties under his jurisdiction. He'd come home battered and exhausted, and Margaret would be there, teaching during the days, transforming their house into more of a home during the evenings, building a life that welcomed him back each time. It wasn't easy. There were nights when Margaret lay awake worrying, mornings when Caleb left despite injuries that weren't fully healed, arguments about safety and risk and the balance between duty and self-preservation. But they learned to communicate through the hard things, to trust each other with their fears and frustrations. The town watched their marriage with interest and growing respect. They saw Margaret transform from the proud schoolteacher who'd fought for acceptance into a woman who managed independence and partnership with equal grace. They saw Caleb grow from a man running from his past into one who'd found purpose and belonging. And they saw something else, too. The way Caleb and Margaret looked at each other, even after the novelty had worn off and the reality had set in. The way they stood a little straighter when the other was near. The way they moved in unconscious synchrony. The way they'd built something that looked like it would last. A year after their wedding, on a warm spring evening, with wildflowers blooming across the hills, Caleb came home from a particularly long circuit to find Margaret sitting on their porch with news. "How long were you gone this time?" she asked as he dismounted. 5 weeks. Longest yet." He climbed the steps and sank into the chair beside her. "Miss me?" "Every day." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. Her eyes were bright, her smile barely contained, and suddenly he knew. "Margaret?" "I'm pregnant," she said softly. "About 3 months along. Doc Morrison confirmed it last week." The world seemed to tilt and resettle. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, feeling joy and terror and wonder crash over him in equal waves. "A baby," he whispered. "We're going to have a baby." "We are." She pulled back to look at his face. "Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He cupped her face in his hands, terrified, amazed, grateful, all of it. But mostly, just happy. They sat together as the sun set, talking about the future in concrete terms now, nurseries and names and how they'd manage with Caleb's job and a child. It wouldn't be simple, but nothing worth having ever was. And as the stars emerged one by one and Red Hollow settled into peaceful sleep around them, Caleb Vance and Margaret Vance sat on the porch of the home they'd built together and marveled at how far they'd come from that first night in the ranger cabin. They'd been forced together by necessity, bound by survival, and tested by violence. But they'd chosen each other freely, built a partnership on trust and respect, and created something that would outlast them both. The storm that had brought them together was long past. The battles they'd fought were won, and what stretched before them now was the quiet, profound work of building a life, not in spite of the hardships, but because of them. They were no longer the outlaw and the schoolteacher, the deputy and the woman who'd saved him. They were simply Caleb and Margaret Vance, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and decided to stay, who'd faced the worst the world could throw at them and come out stronger, who'd turned forced isolation into chosen partnership and made it into something beautiful. And in a land where survival was never guaranteed and tomorrow was always uncertain, they'd created something rare and precious, a home, a future, and a love that had been forged in fire and would endure through whatever came next. Together, always together.